Get your hands off that yoke in my imagination. Because there is no way on God's earth I am letting a man like you fly anything heavier than a kite you're trash, dressed up in 4 stripes. And everyone in this boarding line can see it, but apparently the airline... Ma'am, I'm the captain of this aircraft. I'll be flying you to Houston this afternoon. Of course you are. Of course they put you up front, where it looks good for the cameras, and stuck some poor white boy in the right seat to actually keep the plane in the air. I've flown 40 years. Son, I know exactly how this works. I'd like to speak to whoever's really in charge of this cockpit before we push back. I am who's really in charge of this cockpit. Ma'am, I've been flying for 23 years. 16 of them as captain. I'd be glad to show you my certifications if that would put your mind at ease. But I am going to need you to take your seat so we can depart on schedule. Don't you patronize me with your little certificate speech. I've seen men like you get handed things they didn't earn my whole life. And I am not interested in being the experiment that finds out the hard way what that costs the rest of us at 35,000 feet. Captain Elias Coker did not raise his voice. 23 years in the air had taught him that raising his voice in a moment exactly like this one accomplished nothing except confirming whatever conclusion the passenger in front of him had already reached before he'd finished his first sentence. He kept his hands loose at his sides, his posture easy, his voice level, the same voice he used at 2 a.m. when his son Theo woke from a nightmare and needed someone calm in the doorway. Not someone who matched fear with fear. Ma'am, I understand you have concerns. I'm not going to argue you out of them standing here in a jet bridge. What I will tell you is that in 23 years and roughly 11,000 flight hours, I have never once lost an aircraft. And that record is not going to change today because of how this conversation started. Now please, take your seat. We have a schedule to keep. She glared at him a moment longer, gripping the strap of her carry-on like a weapon she hadn't yet decided to use, and said the thing that would sit lodged behind his ribs for longer than she likely intended. I'll be watching every move you make today. Every single one. Captain Elias Coker, 46 years old. Single father of an 11-year-old boy, currently 3 states away with his grandmother. A man who had spent 23 years proving, flight after flight, a competence that some passengers still refused. Even now, even after everything. To extend him on sight, looked at this furious woman in the jet bridge and said, very quietly, with no edge in it at all, "That's your right. Ma'am, watch closely. I think you'll be satisfied with what you see." He turned and walked forward, toward the cockpit, toward the small folded photograph clipped to his flight bag that he touched, as he always did. Before stepping through that door, he had no idea, in that moment, exactly how literally she was about to get her wish, that before this particular flight ended, hours later than scheduled, diverted twice, and carrying a level of mechanical and human crisis that no routine afternoon run to Houston should ever have contained. Every single person aboard, including the woman who had just promised to watch his every move, would in fact be watching him. Closely. For reasons that had nothing to do with the color of his skin and everything to do with whether the man in the captain's seat could bring 186 people home alive. This is the story of Captain Elias Coker. A small folded photograph clipped to a flight bag, and one ordinary afternoon flight that became anything but ordinary. 6 crises at 35,000 feet. A hydraulic failure no manual fully prepared him for. And a debt of trust that would come due in the cabin of a regional jet, in a way nobody boarding that aircraft could have predicted. To understand the photograph clipped to his bag, you have to understand the year that made Elias Coker a father before he had finished grieving the woman who made him one. He had been 35 years old, 12 years into his career. A first officer working his way steadily toward a captaincy he had wanted since he was 9 years old, and his own uncle. A Tuskegee airman's grandson and a career Air Force pilot had taken him up in a small Cessna and let him feel, for the first time, the specific and total silence of being entirely responsible for something that could kill you if you stopped paying attention. He had married, at 31, a woman named Renee, a high school chemistry teacher, sharp and funny, and entirely unimpressed by the romance of aviation, which Elias had always found enormously refreshing after years of dating women who seemed more interested in the uniform than the man wearing it, and they had tried, for 3 years, to have a child, through the specific grinding patience that fertility struggles demand of a couple, before finally, against odds their doctor had described as cautiously discouraging, conceiving the son who would become Theo. Renee had died 11 months after Theo's birth. Not suddenly, not without warning, but slowly, over a brutal 8-month battle with an aggressive ovarian cancer that had been diagnosed only weeks after she finished breastfeeding. A diagnosis that the oncologist had said, more than once, in the careful clinical language doctors use to soften unbearable things, might have been caught earlier if the symptoms hadn't been so easily mistaken for ordinary postpartum recovery. Elias had taken every day of leave the airline allowed him and had then taken unpaid leave on top of that. Burning through savings, the two of them had built for a house they would now never buy together. Sitting beside Renee's hospital bed with their son on his lap, watching his wife disappear by careful degrees while their child grew, in the same room. By careful degrees. The two processes running in parallel with a cruelty that Elias had never fully found language for. Even years later, even after he had built an entire functioning life on the other side of it. She died on a Thursday in March. And Elias had held her hand until the very end, and had then carried his 11-month-old son out of that hospital room into a life that he had no template for. No script. No map drawn by anyone who had walked this exact road before him in any way that felt sufficiently close to copy. He had made in the parking garage of that hospital, sitting in his car with Theo strapped into his car seat in the back. Crying in the specific, exhausted way infants cry when they sense wrongness in the air without understanding its source. The same fierce and uncomplicated vow that fathers in his exact position have made since the beginning of fatherhood, that this child was never, for a single day of his life, going to wonder whether he was loved enough. Regardless of what it cost his father to make that true. What it cost him, across the following decade, was considerably, and he never pretended otherwise to himself, even when he kept the full weight of it from his son. He took 18 months of reduced flying after Renee's death, accepting a pay cut and a junior schedule he had not held in years, simply to be present for the kind of round-the-clock infant care that a brand-new single father cannot manage from 35,000 feet. His own mother, Loretta, had stepped in with the specific fierce devotion of a grandmother who had buried her own husband young and understood. In her bones. Exactly what Elias was facing, relocating temporarily from 2 states away to live with him through the hardest first year, teaching him things about caring for an infant that Renee would have known instinctively and that Elias had to learn through trial, error, and his mother's patient, occasionally exasperated instruction. He remembered, with a clarity that surprised him even years later, the specific terror of the first night his mother had to be away, called back home for her own father's medical emergency, leaving Elias entirely alone with a 14-month-old who had developed, that exact week, a sudden and inexplicable refusal to sleep through the night. He had walked the floor of his small apartment for hours, Theo screaming against his shoulder, his own exhaustion compounding with grief he had not yet fully processed, and the specific, Isolating fear that only a parent flying entirely without a co-pilot can know the terror of having no one to confirm his reading of a crying child's needs. No second set of eyes to catch what he might be missing. He had called the pediatric nurse line twice that night, both times to be told, gently, that everything described sounded within normal range, and both times feeling, despite the reassurance, a fresh wave of the specific loneliness that single parenthood produces in its hardest hours. The knowledge that whatever happened next, the deciding was entirely his, with no one beside him to share either the burden or the blame. Theo had finally slept, near dawn, and Elias had sat in the gray early light with his son finally quiet against his chest, and had allowed himself, for the first time since Renee's death, 11 months earlier, to weep fully and without restraint, not for himself, but for the specific unbearable fact that his wife would never know this version of their son, would never see him sleeping the particular way he slept when he finally surrendered to exhaustion, would never hear the specific quality of his laugh that was already, even at 14 months, recognizably his own and recognizably hers in equal measure. He had returned to a full captaincy only in the last 6 years. As Theo grew old enough to manage longer stretches with his grandmother, and as Elias himself grew steadier in the particular competence that grief eventually produces in those who survive it long enough to build something on the other side of it. The photograph clipped to his flight bag, worn soft at the corners from years of handling, showed Theo at 8, gap-toothed and grinning, holding up a model airplane he had built himself from a kit. The specific unguarded pride of a child who did not yet fully understand that the world contained passengers who would decide, before his father finished a single sentence, exactly what kind of man must be sitting in that cockpit. Elias touched that photograph before every single flight. The same ritual. Years and counting. Not as superstition, but as orientation, a way of remembering. In the seconds before he stepped through the cockpit door. Exactly which version of himself needed to bring this aircraft and everyone aboard it home safely, regardless of what the cabin behind him happened to contain. The woman from the jet bridge, her name, Elias would learn from the gate agent's quiet, apologetic briefing before departure, was Dorothy Vance, 71 years old. A retired airline employee herself, decades removed from a ground operations career that had clearly shaped, in ways neither flattering nor entirely her fault, a set of assumptions about who belonged in which seats of an aircraft that the intervening decades had not managed to dislodge, settled into seat 3A with the rigid, watchful posture of someone who had announced her surveillance and intended to make good on the threat. This would matter later, in ways neither of them could have anticipated in that jet bridge exchange. For now, it was simply the opening note of a flight that would, before its end, ask Elias Coker to demonstrate, under genuine and escalating pressure, exactly the competence Dorothy Vance had arrived, convinced he did not possess, and would ask her, in turn, to confront exactly what that conviction had cost her. Across a lifetime of watching capable people through the narrow lens of her own unexamined assumptions, the flight's first sign of trouble came 40 minutes after takeoff, at cruising altitude, in the unglamorous form of a hydraulic system warning light that flickered on, held for 3 seconds, and flickered off the kind of intermittent indication that experienced pilots learn to take seriously without yet treating as confirmed catastrophe. Because aircraft systems sometimes produce false or transient warnings that resolve themselves. And a captain who treats every flicker as Chapter 11 of the emergency checklist quickly exhausts both his crew and his own judgment. "Did you see that?" First Officer Priya Raman asked, her own eyes already moving across the relevant gauges with the brisk, focused attention that had made Elias glad. From the first day they'd been paired together 8 months earlier. To have her in the right seat. I saw it. Run the cross-check. Elias kept his voice level. The same calm that had served him through every genuine emergency of his career. Because a captain's voice is itself a piece of equipment aboard an aircraft. Every bit as load-bearing as a hydraulic line. And a captain who lets his voice betray uncertainty before uncertainty is actually confirmed does real. Measurable damage to his crew's capacity to think clearly. The cross-check, run carefully against the relevant systems, showed no immediate confirming evidence of an actual hydraulic problem, pressure readings within normal range. No corresponding fluid quantity drop. Nothing beyond the single transient flicker, and Elias made the judgment call. One of 1,000 such calls a captain makes across a career. To continue the flight while monitoring the system closely rather than declaring an emergency over a single ambiguous indication. He would be wrong about the wisdom of that specific patience within the hour, though not wrong in any sense that reflected poor judgment in the moment. Because the information available to him at that exact point in the flight did not yet support a more dramatic response, and second-guessing a reasonable decision after the fact, with information that had not yet existed when the decision was made. Is the particular cruelty hindsight specializes in the first human crisis of the flight, unrelated to the still uncertain hydraulic question, arrived from row 19, where a call light illuminated and flight attendant Marisol Vega found a man named Gregory Hutchins, 52, in a state of escalating physical distress that registered within the careful assessment of the flight's lead flight attendant as something considerably more serious than ordinary turbulence anxiety. My chest. Gregory managed, pale and sweating, his hand pressed against his sternum. It's been tight since we took off, and now it's getting worse. And I'm scared this might be my heart. Have you had heart problems before? Mr. Hutchins? Marisol asked, kneeling in the aisle beside him. My father died of a heart attack at 55. I'm 52. I've been waiting for this exact thing to happen to me for 3 years. Ever since I crossed 50. And now it's happening on a plane. Of all places. Where there's nothing anyone can actually do for me. His breath came short. I should have gone to the doctor last month when I had that first twinge. I told myself it was nothing. I told myself I was being paranoid. You're not being paranoid right now. And that's what matters, Marisol said. We've got a physician assistant traveling with us today. And he's going to take good care of you. I need you to try to stay as calm and still as you can while he gets to you. David Okafor, the physician assistant, arrived within 90 seconds and began the careful assessment that the limited tools of a commercial cabin allowed. Rapid pulse, clammy skin, pain that the patient described as radiating slightly into his jaw, a symptom cluster concerning enough that David requested Marisol relay the situation to the flight deck immediately. As a developing medical emergency requiring captain-level decision-making about whether the flight's destination remained appropriate or whether a closer diversion airport should be considered. How long have you had the chest tightness? David asked, taking Gregory's pulse manually while he spoke. Since takeoff, maybe 40 minutes now. It comes and goes. But it's been getting worse the last 10 minutes especially. Any history of anxiety or panic attacks? No. I'm anxious right now. Obviously. But this isn't that. This feels different. Physical. Like there's an actual weight sitting on my chest. David's expression remained carefully neutral. The practiced calm of a medical professional managing a genuine concern without alarming the patient further. But Marisol, watching closely, could see the specific, focused seriousness that told her this was not, in David's assessment, simple anxiety. Elias absorbed this report calmly, weighing it against the still unresolved hydraulic question. A combination of simultaneous pressures that would have rattled a less experienced captain, but that Elias had learned. Across 23 years, to hold in separate mental compartments without letting either crisis contaminate his clear thinking about the other. Tell Mr. Okafor, I want updates every 5 minutes, he told Priya, and pull up the nearest suitable diversion airports along our current route, just so we have options ready if this escalates. The diversion options, once identified, included a regional airport roughly 40 minutes ahead with adequate runway length, more importantly, an on-field emergency medical response capability sufficient for a genuine cardiac event, information Elias filed away without yet acting on it. Because Gregory Hutchins's symptoms, while concerning, had not yet crossed the threshold that would justify the cost, delay, and complexity of an unplanned diversion, and a captain who diverts at the first ambiguous medical report. Every time, quickly becomes a captain whose judgment nobody fully trusts on the occasions when diversion is genuinely necessary. David Okafor, working with Marisol Vega, administered the cabin's available aspirin per protocol, kept Gregory as calm and as still as the situation allowed, and reported back, at the requested 5-minute intervals, a status that fluctuated without clearly resolving in either direction, neither rapidly worsening in a way that would force an immediate diversion decision, nor improving in a way that would let everyone exhale and continue toward Houston with full confidence. The second crisis of the flight unfolded in the economy cabin, 3 rows from the rear galley, where a woman named Janelle Whitfield, traveling alone with a developmentally disabled 14-year-old son named Marcus, found herself contending with both her son's escalating sensory distress at the unfamiliar pressure changes and noise of the flight, and the increasingly audible irritation of nearby passengers who had not been briefed, and had no particular interest in being briefed, on the specific patience that supporting a child experiencing sensory overload sometimes required. Marcus had begun, somewhere over the first hour of flight, to rock rhythmically in his seat and make a low, repetitive vocalization that was, to Janelle's practiced ear, the unmistakable early sign of a building meltdown rather than mere discomfort. A meltdown, she recognized, from years of careful observation, as something she could likely manage successfully if given a small amount of patience and physical space from the surrounding cabin, resources that the passenger directly behind them, a businessman named Charles Pruitt, was making increasingly clear he had no intention of extending. "Can you get him to stop that?" Charles said, leaning forward into the gap between seats with the specific irritated entitlement of a man who had decided his own comfort outranked whatever was actually happening 1 row ahead of him. "I've got a conference call to prepare for, and I cannot concentrate with that noise." "He's autistic," Janelle said, her voice tight, with the particular controlled patience of a parent who has had this exact conversation more times than she can count, and has learned, through hard experience, that defensiveness rarely helps. "He's overwhelmed by the flight. I'm working on it. I'd appreciate some patience. I'd appreciate not having paid for a seat next to a screaming child, autistic or otherwise. There are accommodations for this, aren't there? Special seating? Or something? Why is this my problem to manage?" Marisol Vega, alerted by the escalating tension, arrived at the row with the calm, practiced authority of a flight attendant who had handled exactly this configuration of conflict more times than she could easily count, and found Janelle near tears. Caught between managing her son's genuine and worsening distress and absorbing a stranger's open hostility about it, "Sir," Marisol said, "I'm going to need you to lower your voice and let me work with this family directly. This young man is having a difficult time, and our job is to help, not to add pressure. My job isn't to suffer through it silently. Charles said, I have actual work to do. What followed was the practical work of de-escalation that Marisol had refined across years of exactly these situations. She arranged, working with another flight attendant, to relocate Charles Pruitt to an open seat several rows forward, away from the immediate proximity that had made the conflict possible. Framing the move not as a punishment, but as a practical solution to his stated need for quiet. A framing that allowed Charles to accept the relocation without feeling he had lost an argument, which mattered considerably to actually resolving the tension rather than simply suppressing it. She then knelt beside Janelle's row, at the child's level rather than looming, and asked Janelle directly what specifically would help. Noise-canceling headphones. If you have any spare, Janelle said, and maybe just some quiet around us for a bit. He does better when there's less stimulation, not more attention on him. Marisol found a set of the airline's premium noise-canceling headphones, normally reserved for first-class amenity kits, and brought them back, along with a weighted blanket she had located in an unclaimed first-class bag with the owner's permission once she explained the situation. And the combination reduced auditory stimulation, the calming pressure of the weighted blanket, and simply more physical and social space around the row allowed Marcus's escalating distress to gradually subside over the following 20 minutes. His rhythmic rocking slowing and then stopping as his nervous system, given the resources it actually needed rather than the punishment a stranger had wanted to impose, found its way back to a more regulated state. Thank you, Janelle said, her own composure visibly cracking now that the immediate crisis had passed. I get that reaction so often. People just assume I'm not managing him properly, instead of understanding that managing him properly sometimes looks exactly like what you just watched. I spend more energy managing other people's reactions to him than I spend managing his actual needs. Some days, you don't have to manage my reaction, Marisol said. I've got a nephew on the spectrum. I know what this looks like when it's handled well, which is exactly what you were doing before that man decided his conference call mattered more than your son's actual distress. There was a third human crisis before the hydraulic situation escalated, and it unfolded quietly, almost invisibly, in row Jednaiste, where an elderly man named Walter Brennan, 83, traveling alone for what he had told the gate agent was the first time since his wife's death 2 years earlier, sat rigid and silent for the better part of 90 minutes, declining the meal service, staring at nothing in particular. The specific frozen stillness that Marisol Vega, making her rounds, recognized within seconds as something requiring attention rather than simple disinterest. Mr. Brennan, can I get you anything? You haven't touched your drink? I'm all right, Walter said, in the flat, automatic tone of a man who has said the words enough times that they no longer carry any actual conviction. You don't have to be all right to fly with us today, Marisol said, gently, settling briefly into the empty aisle seat beside him. Is there something on your mind? Walter was quiet for a long moment, and then, in the specific way that a carefully maintained composure sometimes simply gives way once someone extends the right kind of attention, he said, I'm flying to my granddaughter's wedding, first family event since my wife passed. I keep thinking about how she would have packed for this trip, fussed over what I was wearing, reminded me 3 times not to forget my good shoes. I don't know how to walk into that wedding alone, surrounded by everyone who's going to be looking at the empty space where she should be standing beside me. Marisol listened, asked careful, genuine questions about his late wife, about the granddaughter getting married, about the specific shape of the grief Walter was carrying into an occasion that should have been purely joyful, and spent the better part of 20 minutes simply being present with him in a way that allowed him. By the time she had to move on to other duties, to speak with something closer to peace than the rigid silence she had first found him in. "Thank you for asking," he told her. "Most people just leave an old man alone with his thoughts. Sometimes that's the wrong kindness to offer." It was at this point in the flight, nearly 2 hours in, with Gregory Hutchins's cardiac symptoms holding in their uncertain middle ground, and Marcus Whitfield's crisis finally resolving, and Walter Brennan settling into a steadier grief, that the hydraulic warning light returned not as a brief flicker this time, but as a sustained illumination accompanied, within 90 seconds, by a corresponding and unmistakable drop in hydraulic fluid quantity that confirmed, beyond any ambiguity, an actual and active hydraulic system failure. "Captain, we've got a confirmed loss in System B," Priya said, her voice tight but controlled. Exactly the register Elias had trained her, across 8 months of flying together, to maintain under pressure, quantities dropping steadily. This isn't a sensor glitch. Elias felt the specific, focused clarity that 23 years of training produces in exactly this kind of moment. Not panic, not even particularly elevated alarm, but a narrowing and sharpening of attention onto the precise sequence of actions the situation now required. "Run the QRH for hydraulic system failure. I'll fly. You read and confirm." What followed was 40 minutes of the most demanding flying of Elias Coker's career, though demanding in a specific, methodical, checklist-driven way that bore little resemblance to the dramatic crisis a passenger imagination might construct around the phrase hydraulic failure. A modern aircraft, designed with redundancy, specifically to survive exactly this kind of single-system failure, does not fall out of the sky when one hydraulic system fails. It becomes harder to fly, requiring more physical effort and more careful management of control surfaces that now operate with reduced assistance. And it requires, critically, a landing performed with awareness that braking, steering, and flap deployment may all be affected in ways that demand a longer runway, a more careful approach, and considerably more margin for error than an ordinary landing provides. System B quantity reads 0. Priya reported, 15 minutes into the emergency. Her voice still controlled, but carrying the specific weight of confirming the worst-case scenario within the checklist branching logic. Complete loss. Not partial. Copy. Complete loss of System B. Elias kept his hands steady on the controls, feeling the subtle but unmistakable change in how the aircraft now responded heavier, slower to answer his inputs. The specific physical sensation of flying a machine that had lost some of its normal assistance and now required him to work considerably harder for the same precision he was accustomed to achieving with comparative ease. Continue the checklist. What's our status on alternate gear extension? Alternate extension procedures confirmed available. We'll need to use the backup system for gear and may have reduced braking authority on landing. Flaps will be limited to a lower setting than standard, which means we'll need additional approach speed and considerably more runway. This was the precise moment, Elias would later reflect, when 23 years of training revealed its actual value, not in any dramatic, cinematic sense, but in the simple, profound fact that neither he nor Priya needed to improvise a single element of their response. Every step had been drilled, repeated, simulated in training scenarios specifically designed to produce exactly this combination of failures, until the response had become less a decision tree requiring active thought and more a kind of physical fluency. The same way a concert pianist does not consciously calculate which finger strikes which key, but simply plays. The years of practice having moved the precise mechanics below the level of conscious deliberation, freeing conscious attention for the larger judgment calls that genuinely required it. I want the longest runway at our diversion option, even if it means a few extra minutes of flight time, Elias said. Given the reduced braking and flap limitations, I'd rather have margin we don't need than need margin we don't have. Copy. I'll coordinate with approach control on runway selection. The communication with air traffic control, conducted throughout this sequence, in the specific clipped, precise vocabulary that aviation radio communication demands, proceeded with a calm professionalism on both ends that belied the genuine seriousness of the situation. Controllers cleared other traffic to provide priority handling. Emergency services were alerted and positioned along the selected runway as standard precaution. And the entire surrounding system of the national airspace quietly reorganized itself around the needs of one aircraft in genuine, if controlled, difficulty. 15 minutes before the actual approach began, a second complication emerged that tested the crew's composure further. The alternate gear extension system, while functional, produced an asymmetric indication on the landing gear status display, the nose gear and right main gear showing confirmed down and locked, but the left main gear indicator remaining ambiguous, neither clearly confirming nor clearly denying proper extension. I don't like that left main indication, Priya said. Neither do I. Let's run the visual confirmation procedure. This required, per the checklist, a low pass by the tower for visual inspection of the landing gear configuration before committing to the actual landing, an additional step that added time and complexity to an already demanding sequence, but that Elias considered entirely non-negotiable given the stakes of getting this specific detail wrong. The low pass, conducted at reduced altitude directly over the airfield, allowed tower personnel with binoculars to visually confirm what the ambiguous cockpit indicator could not. The left main gear was, in fact, properly extended and locked. The indicator fault being a separate and comparatively minor electrical issue rather than an actual gear extension failure. This confirmation, relayed calmly by the tower controller, allowed Elias and Priya to proceed with the actual landing with full confidence in the aircraft's configuration. A confidence that had been earned through exactly the kind of careful, unhurried verification that distinguishes professional crisis management from mere hopeful guessing. Elias and Priya worked through the checklist with the precise, almost liturgical calm that proper training produces, confirming each step aloud, cross-checking each other's actions, building toward the decision that both of them, independently and then in immediate agreement, once they compared notes, recognized as unavoidable. This flight was not continuing to Houston. It was diverting, now, to the nearest airport with a runway long enough and emergency response capability robust enough to handle a landing with a confirmed hydraulic system failure. A landing that would require fire and rescue equipment standing by as a precaution, regardless of how smoothly Elias expected and fully intended to execute it. I need you to make the PA, Elias told Priya, while I coordinate with approach control. Keep it calm. Keep it factual. Don't editorialize past what they need to know. Priya's announcement to the cabin, delivered in the carefully measured tone both pilots had practiced across years of training for exactly this kind of moment, informed the passengers that the aircraft was experiencing a mechanical issue, that the crew was trained extensively for exactly this situation, that they would be diverting to the nearest suitable airport as a precaution, and that emergency vehicles would be visible on the runway as a standard safety measure rather than an indication that anything had gone catastrophically wrong. It was, by design, almost aggressively undramatic, because the specific danger of a genuine aviation emergency is very often not the mechanical failure itself, which trained crews and redundant systems are built to handle. But the panic that an overly dramatic framing can produce among passengers, who then make the actual landing more dangerous through their own fear-driven behavior. It was during this exact stretch of the flight, the 40-minute sequence of methodical, high-stakes flying that would determine whether 186 people landed safely on a runway considerably less forgiving than the destination they had originally booked, that the flight's third human crisis unfolded in the cabin, entirely without Elias's awareness until much later, when the full account of that long afternoon was eventually pieced together. A young woman named Bethany Cross, 24 years old, traveling alone, had been managing, in increasing silence, what would later be identified as a severe and escalating panic attack, triggered by the combination of Priya's diversion announcement and a pre-existing flight anxiety that Bethany had been white-knuckling through the entire flight, her composure finally giving way entirely once the words mechanical issue and emergency vehicles entered her hearing. Marisol Vega, moving through the cabin, checking on passengers in the methodical pattern. Her training and experience had built into instinct. Found Bethany hyperventilating, her hands shaking too badly to manage her own seatbelt, tears streaming as she repeated, quietly, over and over, "We're going to crash. We're going to crash. I knew this would happen. I shouldn't have flown." Marisol knelt in the aisle beside her. The same posture every member of this story's crew seemed to have independently learned mattered more than any specific words. And said, with the calm, practiced authority of someone who had talked dozens of frightened passengers through exactly this kind of spiral, "Bethany, look at me. We are not crashing. I need you to hear that clearly. This aircraft is designed with backup systems, specifically for situations like this one. And our captain has handled emergencies like this in training more times than either of us could count. What's happening right now is the system working exactly the way it's supposed to work when something goes wrong, which is precisely why we have this kind of redundancy built in. I need you to breathe with me." What followed was 20 minutes of careful, patient grounding work, conducted while the cockpit, simultaneously, and without either crew member knowing the details of the other's crisis, worked through the technical demands of the actual hydraulic emergency, a strange and characteristic feature of aviation crises, that the cabin and the cockpit often experience entirely separate versions of the same event. The cockpit absorbed in precise technical procedure while the cabin processes raw, unstructured fear, with the flight attendants serving as the crucial translation layer between the two. Bethany's breathing gradually slowed. Her hands gradually steadied. And by the time the aircraft began its actual descent toward the diversion airport, she had reached a state Marisol would later describe as functional terror, still frightened, but no longer spiraling, capable of following instructions and bracing properly rather than being so consumed by panic that her own safety during the landing itself might have been compromised. The landing, when it finally came, was, by every objective measure that mattered, a triumph of exactly the training and competence that Dorothy Vance had questioned in the jet bridge 3 hours earlier. Elias Coker brought the aircraft down on a runway considerably longer than standard procedure required for this specific situation, used every available technique to manage the reduced hydraulic assistance to control surfaces and braking, and rolled to a stop with a margin of runway remaining that the tower controller, watching the whole sequence, would later describe in his own incident report as textbook execution of a non-normal procedure. Under genuine system degradation, the cabin erupted, as cabins often do after a tense landing successfully completed, into a mixture of relieved applause, audible exhale, and the particular nervous laughter that follows genuine fear once the danger has actually passed. Fire and rescue vehicles, positioned as the standard precaution Priya's announcement had described, confirmed visually that no fire or additional mechanical danger existed, and the aircraft was cleared to taxi to the gate under its own power. The hydraulic failure having been managed entirely within the parameters the crew's training had prepared them for. Elias sat in the cockpit for a long moment after the engines finally spun down, doing the thing he rarely allowed himself mid-crisis, which was simply feel, all at once. The physical toll of 40 minutes of intensely focused flying his hands. He noticed, were trembling slightly, now that the demand for steadiness had finally passed. The specific delayed physical response that comes only once a trained professional's body is finally permitted to register what it has just been through. "Nice work," Priya said quietly, her own hands not entirely steady either. "You too," Elias said. "Couldn't have run that checklist clean without you reading it exactly right. Every step." What happened next? In the gate area of an airport that had never expected to host 186 diverted, shaken passengers on an otherwise unremarkable afternoon, became the part of this story that mattered most. Because it is where the threads of the flight's earlier human crises finally converged with the larger mechanical emergency in ways nobody could have orchestrated. Gregory Hutchins, whose chest pain had never fully resolved across the entire eventful flight, was taken immediately by waiting paramedics to the nearest hospital, where testing would confirm, within hours, a genuine cardiac event, not the most severe variety, but real and requiring immediate treatment. Treatment that the diversion to a city with adequate medical facilities, rather than continuing toward a more distant Houston, likely delivered to him meaningfully sooner than the original flight plan would have allowed. David Okafor, the physician assistant who had monitored him throughout, accompanied him to the ambulance, continuing his care until hospital staff could take over, and would later say, in a letter to the airline, that the diversion decision, made for entirely separate mechanical reasons, had almost certainly saved Gregory's life by accident. A strange and humbling reminder of how interconnected the apparently separate crises of a single flight can turn out to be. Janelle Whitfield and her son Marcus, given the unexpected layover the diversion produced, found themselves seated near Dorothy Vance in the gate area. And it was there, in the strange, exposed intimacy of a delayed flight's waiting room, that the story's central reckoning finally began to take shape. Dorothy Vance had spent the entire 40-minute emergency sequence in a state of escalating, visible fear that had nothing to do with skepticism about the crew and everything to do with the simple universal terror of being aboard an aircraft with a confirmed mechanical failure. A fear that had, somewhere in the white-knuckled middle of it, produced an unexpected and uncomfortable clarity in her about the conversation she'd had in the jet bridge 3 hours earlier. She had watched, throughout the emergency, the calm, measured competence of Priya Raman's cabin announcements, had felt the careful, controlled handling of the aircraft during what she correctly understood, from her own decades in the airline industry, to be a genuinely demanding, non-normal landing, and had found herself in the rawest minutes of the actual crisis, praying not in any organized religious sense, simply the desperate, wordless appeal of a frightened person that whoever was at the controls knew exactly what they were doing, with an intensity that left no room whatsoever for the racial calculus she had brought into the jet bridge hours earlier. In the gate area, watching the news unfold in fragments around her passengers, comparing notes about what they'd experienced, a local news crew that had arrived to cover the diversion, gathering brief comments from shaken travelers, Dorothy heard, for the first time, the full shape of what had actually happened in that cockpit, the confirmed hydraulic failure, the methodical execution of emergency procedures, The textbook landing that the tower controller's own assessment. Relayed secondhand through an airline representative now managing the gate area. Had specifically credited to the captain's exact handling of the non-normal checklist. She sat with this information for a long moment. And then, in the specific way that genuine shame sometimes produces unexpected courage rather than only defensive retreat, she stood, crossed the gate area, and found Captain Elias Coker standing near the gate counter, still in uniform, conferring quietly with airline operations staff about rebooking logistics for the delayed passengers. Captain, her voice, when he turned, carried none of the contempt from the jet bridge. The gate and I to say something to you, and I'd like you to actually hear it. Even though I know I don't deserve the courtesy of being heard after how I behaved this morning. Elias regarded her for a moment. Recognizing her immediately, his expression giving away nothing of what he might have been entitled to feel. I'm listening. Ma'am, I told you I'd be watching every move you made today. I want you to know that I was. I watched the whole thing, the way your first officer's voice stayed steady on that announcement. The way this aircraft came down on that runway like it was the most ordinary thing in the world, even though I know from 40 years working in this industry myself, that it absolutely was not ordinary. That what you and your crew did up there took every bit of the competence. I told you in that jet bridge, I doubted you had. Her composure, formidable across the entire flight, finally cracked. I spent this whole flight terrified, and somewhere in the middle of that terror, the only thing I actually wanted was for the person flying this plane to be exactly as capable as the job required. And you were. You were exactly that capable, and I am ashamed, genuinely and completely ashamed, that it took being scared half to death for me to actually see what was true the entire time. Before any of this happened, before I had any proof at all beyond your own word and your own uniform, which should have been enough, and which I decided wasn't enough, because of nothing more than what you look like. Elias was quiet for a long moment, weighing several possible responses, before settling on the one that felt most honest. I appreciate you saying that. Ma'am, I won't pretend it doesn't matter to hear it. He paused. Can I ask you something? Not to put you further on the spot. I'm genuinely curious. Of course. What made you decide, in that jet bridge, before I'd said more than a few sentences, exactly what you decided about me? Dorothy was quiet for a long moment. And when she answered, her voice had dropped into something more reflective, more exposed than the contempt of hours earlier. I worked ground operations for this airline for 31 years, starting in 1979, in an era when black pilots were vanishingly rare, and the few who existed faced scrutiny and sabotage from colleagues that would shock people who think discrimination in aviation ended with desegregation laws. I watched. More than once, qualified black pilots get passed over, undermined, second-guessed in ways their white colleagues never were, by people who looked exactly like the people I worked alongside every single day. And somewhere across those decades, I think I absorbed an assumption I never fully examined, that if a black man had made it to a captain's seat, something about the system must have bent for him, in a way it never bent for anyone else. That his presence there was itself evidence of an unearned exception rather than earned competence. I built that assumption out of watching real discrimination happen to other people, which I think is the most uncomfortable part of admitting it. Now, I didn't invent the prejudice in a vacuum. I built it by watching unfairness, and somehow concluding the unfairness ran in a direction I never actually examined closely enough to notice I had it backward. That's a remarkably honest answer, Elias said. Was there a specific pilot you remember? Someone you watched go through what you're describing? Dorothy's face changed. Something old and painful surfacing. Marcus Holloway, class of 1981. One of the first black captains this airline ever upgraded. I worked his gates more than once in those years. I watched senior crew members second-guess his fuel calculations in front of ground staff. Watched a check airman fail him on a check ride for an error so minor that two white captains I personally knew had made the identical mistake and passed without comment. I watched him eventually leave the airline for a regional carrier that treated him, by his own account years later when I ran into him at a conference, with considerably more basic respect than this industry's flagship company had ever managed to extend him. She pressed her hand briefly against her own chest, as though something there had grown suddenly tender. I didn't participate in any of that directly. I told myself, for decades, that observing it without actively contributing made me innocent of it. But I watched it happen, repeatedly, to a genuinely excellent pilot. And somewhere in all that watching, I think I absorbed a lesson exactly backward from the one the evidence should have taught me. I should have learned that the system was unfairly hard on black pilots. Instead, I think I learned, somewhere underneath my own awareness, that black pilots were somehow suspect, because so much suspicion kept landing on them. And I never once stopped to ask whether the suspicion itself, rather than anything about the pilots, was the actual problem. What happened to him? Holloway? He flew for the regional carrier for the rest of his career. Retired with an excellent safety record. By all accounts, a superb captain who simply found a workplace willing to actually see him clearly. I think about him often now, more than I have in years, honestly. Because watching you up there today felt like watching the version of his career this industry should have given him from the start, if it had been capable of seeing what was actually in front of it instead of what its own prejudice insisted on seeing. It's a remarkably late one, Dorothy said. 31 years in this industry. And it took watching you save a plane load of people, including myself, for me to actually examine an assumption I should have questioned decades ago. She looked at him directly. I don't expect you to forgive what I said to you this morning. I'm not even certain I should ask you to. But I wanted you to know that I saw it. Finally, clearly, what was actually true the whole time. And that I'm going to be carrying the shame of how long it took me to see it for considerably longer than this delay is going to last. I appreciate that, Elias said. And for what it's worth, ma'am, I don't need you to carry shame forever for it to count. I need you to carry the seeing forward. Into the next jet bridge. The next pilot, who doesn't look like what you expected. That's the only thing that actually changes anything. Going forward. The shame's optional. The seeing isn't, what would you tell Marcus Holloway? If he were standing here right now instead of me? Elias considered the question carefully. I'd tell him the same thing. I'd tell any pilot who came up through what he came up through that the record speaks. Eventually, whether or not the people around you are willing to read it honestly in real time. He retired with an excellent safety record at a carrier that actually saw him. That's not a consolation prize, ma'am. That's a man who built an entire career out of pure competence in an industry that made him fight for every inch of credit this one withheld. I'd want him to know that the fighting wasn't wasted, even though it should never have been required of him in the first place. The reckoning of this story did not end with Dorothy Vance's apology, because the truest reckonings rarely confine themselves to a single conversation. However genuine, it continued, in pieces, through the following weeks and months, carried by people who had been present for one extraordinary afternoon and were willing, each in their own way, to let it change something lasting in how they moved through the world. Gregory Hutchins recovered fully from his cardiac event. Treated promptly at the Diversion City's hospital in a window of time that his cardiologist would later confirm had meaningfully improved his outcome compared to the additional hour or more that continuing to Houston would have added to his treatment delay. He wrote to the airline several weeks later, specifically praising both David Okafor's attentive in-flight care and the flight crew's decision-making, noting, with the particular clarity of someone who has had real cause to think hard about exactly how a chain of decisions saved his life, that the diversion made for one reason had turned out to matter enormously for an entirely separate reason, a fact he found himself thinking about often in the months of recovery that followed. Janelle Whitfield and her son Marcus, whose difficult flight had been considerably eased by Marisol Vega's practical, patient intervention, became something of an unlikely advocate within the airline's own training programs. Janelle having been invited, following a letter she sent describing the incident in detail, to consult with the airline's customer experience team on improving crew training around supporting neurodivergent passengers and their families. The weighted blanket and noise-canceling headphones that had calmed Marcus during the original flight became, within a year, standard equipment carried on every aircraft in the airline's fleet. A small but concrete legacy of one difficult afternoon translated into structural change that would help countless future families. Janelle and Marcus would never meet. Bethany Cross, whose panic attack had been so carefully managed by Marisol Vega during the actual emergency, sought out, in the months following the flight, a structured fear of flying course that had previously felt, to her, like an admission of weakness she wasn't ready to make. She completed the course successfully and flew again. 6 months later, for the first time without the crushing anticipatory dread that had defined her relationship with air travel for years. Crediting the experience of being talked through genuine crisis by a calm, competent professional with finally convincing her that her fear, however real, was not a reliable predictor of actual danger. Charles Pruitt, the businessman whose impatience with Marcus Whitfield's sensory distress had triggered the second crisis of the flight, wrote to the airline as well, several months later, not the complaint his irritation might once have prompted, but an apology, occasioned, he explained, by a colleague's recent disclosure that her own child had been diagnosed with autism, a disclosure that had sent Charles back, with considerable discomfort, to his own behavior on that flight, and to a recognition of exactly how unfair and uninformed his demands of Janelle Whitfield had been. Dorothy Vance's reckoning, the one this story has spent the most time on, continued in a register that surprised even her. She requested, several weeks after the flight, a meeting with the airline's diversity and training department, not to complain or to seek any particular accommodation, but to volunteer, unprompted, to participate in a panel discussion the department was developing about unconscious bias in the airline industry, specifically the kind that had shaped her own 31-year career in ways she had never previously examined publicly. She told her story, the jet bridge, the contempt, the slow unraveling of her own assumption across the terrifying middle of a genuine emergency, the conversation with Elias afterward to successive cohorts of new airline employees, framing it specifically as a cautionary account of how prejudice can survive for decades inside a person who would never describe herself, in any other context, as prejudiced, simply because the assumption goes unexamined long enough to feel like settled wisdom rather than untested bias. I want every person in this room to understand something, she told one such cohort, in a recording that the training department eventually incorporated into its standard onboarding materials with her permission. I am not a cartoon villain. I did not think of myself, walking into that jet bridge, as someone harboring prejudice. I thought of myself as an experienced industry professional, exercising reasonable caution. That is exactly how prejudice survives as long as it does in otherwise ordinary, even well-intentioned people it disguises itself as caution, as experience, as simply knowing how things work. And it takes something as drastic as nearly dying to finally crack that disguise open. I am telling you this story so that you do not need a hydraulic failure of your own to examine the assumptions you are carrying right now. Today, into whatever jet bridge or boardroom or classroom you are about to walk into. A young flight attendant in one of these training sessions, herself a black woman only 2 years into her career, raised her hand afterward and asked the question that Dorothy would later say cut closer to the actual heart of the matter than any other question she'd been asked across dozens of these sessions. Do you think you would have apologized if the flight had landed normally? If there had been no emergency? No proof. Nothing except the captain's own, competent, uneventful handling of an ordinary flight? Dorothy had been quiet for a long moment before answering, because the question deserved the full weight of her honesty, rather than a comfortable deflection. I genuinely don't know, she finally said, and I think that uncertainty is the most important and most uncomfortable part of this entire story. If nothing had gone wrong, I likely would have landed in Houston still carrying my assumption fully intact, having received no dramatic proof to crack it open, free to walk off that aircraft and into the next jet bridge, with the exact same unexamined prejudice I walked in with. That troubles me more than almost anything else about this whole experience, that it took genuine danger, genuine fear for my own life, to finally produce the clarity that should have been available to me all along. On every ordinary, uneventful flight I've ever taken with a black captain, if I had simply been willing to look honestly at the evidence already in front of me, instead of waiting for a crisis to force the looking. She looked directly at the young woman who had asked the question. That is exactly why I tell this story now. To every new employee willing to listen, because I don't want any of you to need your own hydraulic failure before you finally see clearly. The evidence of competence is there on every single ordinary flight. For anyone willing to actually look at it without the filter of assumption standing in the way. She and Elias maintained, in the years following the flight, an occasional and genuinely warm correspondence. Not close friends in any deep sense, but two people who had been through something together that neither would ever fully explain to anyone who hadn't lived it. Checking in periodically, exchanging brief notes on anniversaries of the flight. Two people whose paths had crossed at the worst possible angle and had, through the specific alchemy of crisis and honest reckoning, found their way to something considerably better than where they'd started. Captain Elias Coker flew home, eventually on a replacement aircraft sent to complete the journey to Houston, and then connected, the following day, to the airport nearest his mother's house, where Theo had been staying through the unexpectedly extended duration of his father's eventful trip. His mother, Loretta, met him at the door before he'd even reached the driveway. The particular relieved embrace of a woman who had clearly spent the previous day more worried than her measured phone calls had let on. The news of the diversion and emergency landing having reached her, as these things do, through frantic group texts, among other airline families, and her own anxious tracking of his flight number, once word began circulating. "You had me up half the night, Elias Coker," she said, holding him at arm's length to inspect him properly before pulling him into a second, longer embrace, a hydraulic failure. Of all things, your father would have had something to say about that. "What would Daddy have said?" Elias asked, smiling despite himself. 'Cause his father's voice, even 14 years gone, still arrived, sometimes through his mother's memory of him, in exactly the moments Elias needed it most. He'd have said the same thing he always said when something went wrong that you handled right, that the practice is what you do when nobody's watching, so that the performance takes care of itself when everybody finally is. Loretta studied her son's face for a moment longer. You look tired in a way that's more than just the hours. Baby, what happened up there? He found Theo in the driveway, practicing free throws against the side of the garage with the specific, intense concentration of an 11-year-old who has decided this particular skill matters enormously. And Theo dropped the ball the moment he spotted his father's car and ran to meet him. Dad! Grandma said your flight had an emergency. Are you okay? Is the plane okay? Elias caught his son, lifted him despite Theo's protestation that he was getting too big for that, and held him for a long moment, breathing in the specific smell of his son's hair. Feeling the entire accumulated weight of the day's emergency finally settle into something that made sense. Now that he was holding the reason all of it mattered, everybody's fine. Buddy, the plane's fine. We had a problem with one of the systems, and we landed it safely. Exactly the way we trained for. Were you scared? Elias considered the question seriously, because his son's questions always deserved serious answers rather than reflexive reassurance. I was focused. He said, "There's a difference. Scared is what happens when you don't know what to do. I knew exactly what to do. Every step. Because I've trained for that exact situation more times than I could count. That training is what kept the scared from taking over." Does that make sense? Kind of. Theo said, "I think I'd still be scared, even if I knew what to do." That's fair too. Elias said, "I think everybody's a little scared in a moment like that." Underneath the training just means you act steady even while some part of you is scared, instead of letting the scared part take the controls instead of you. They sat together on the porch steps as the evening cooled. And Theo, with the particular bluntness children sometimes deploy when working their way toward a harder question, asked, "Did you think about Mom? Up there?" When it was happening, Elias was quiet for a moment, surprised, as he often was, by exactly how much his son noticed and carried without being told. "I think about your mom most days, buddy, in one way or another, but up there. Specifically, in the middle of the emergency, no. Honestly, I didn't have room to think about anything except the checklist and the airplane. That's actually how the training works. It clears out everything except what the moment needs from you." He paused. Afterward, though, once it was over, and I was sitting in that cockpit with my hands finally shaking, now that the danger had passed, yeah, I thought about her then. I thought about how she always said the scariest part of loving someone was knowing you couldn't actually protect them from everything, no matter how hard you tried. I think about that a lot. Actually, doing this job, I can train for every mechanical failure there is, and I still can't promise you nothing bad will ever happen to either of us. All I can promise is that I'll be as ready as 23 years of practice can make me. For whatever does happen. Theo leaned against his father's shoulder. The particular trusting weight of a child who has decided across 11 years that his father's steadiness is one of the few genuinely reliable facts of his existence. "I think that's enough," he said. "I think that's actually everything." Theo considered the day's events with the careful seriousness that was, by then, recognizable as an inherited version of his father's own habit of taking hard questions seriously. "I want to be a pilot someday," he said. "Like you. Like Great Uncle James." "You'd be a good one," Elias said. "You've already got the part that matters most. You ask the right questions instead of just wanting the easy answers. But the thing underneath it is not fiction, and you already know it isn't. There are pilots flying commercial aircraft right now, across every airline and every route in this country, who must demonstrate daily a level of competence sufficient to satisfy not only the rigorous certification standards of their profession, but also, frequently, an additional an entirely unearned burden of proof imposed by passengers who have decided before any evidence is available. Exactly what kind of person belongs in that captain's seat? Most flights do not contain a genuine hydraulic emergency alongside multiple human crises compressed into a single afternoon. This story concentrated an unusual density of difficulty into one journey for the sake of showing, clearly and all in one place, both the actual competence required of the people flying our aircraft and the actual cost extracted from those among them who must prove that competence twice over before anyone extends them the benefit of the doubt. The job itself should automatically confer. And here is the thing this story most wants you to carry. The part that is sharper and more specific than times be kind. Dorothy Vance was not a cartoon villain. And her transformation was not produced by Elias Coker performing extraordinary kindness toward her. It was produced by reality itself, by the simple, undeniable fact of his demonstrated competence under genuine pressure, a fact that had been equally true and equally demonstrable before the emergency ever began. Sitting entirely unexamined behind her contempt in the jet bridge, the captain, capable of bringing a hydraulically compromised aircraft to a safe landing, was already in the jet bridge hours earlier. Exactly that capable. Nothing about his competence changed between the boarding gate and the runway. What changed was only Dorothy's willingness, under the specific duress of genuine fear, to finally see what had been true the entire time. That is the question this story leaves you with. More than any other. How many people in your own life are you evaluating not on the evidence actually available to you, but on assumptions built from a lifetime of unexamined pattern matching that you have never once stopped to interrogate? And what would it take? Must it really take a hydraulic failure, a genuine emergency? Something dramatic enough to finally crack the disguise of reasonable caution for you to examine those assumptions before the moment of crisis forces the examination on you? The cost of examining them now, in the calm, ordinary hours before any crisis arrives, is so much smaller than the cost of examining them only once fear has stripped away every comfortable justification you had been using to avoid the harder, earlier look. If this moved you, tell me in the comments about a moment when circumstance forced you to confront an assumption you had been carrying, unexamined, for far too long, and what it cost you, or finally taught you to see clearly. Say their name if the person deserves to be remembered. Share this with somebody who needs the reminder that competence does not announce itself by satisfying anyone's prior expectations. That it simply is what it is, whether or not we extend it the credit it has already. Quietly earned. And subscribe, because there is always another jet bridge, another cockpit, another person deciding too quickly who is sitting in the seat in front of them, and somebody has to be the one who flies the aircraft home safely anyway. Every single time. For no reason except that it is, in the end, the whole job that competence and character actually require of any of us. At 35,000 feet, or anywhere else we happen to be tested, there is a harder truth underneath this story that deserves to be named plainly. Not every captain who faces this kind of unearned scrutiny gets the dramatic vindication of a hydraulic emergency that forces a skeptical passenger to see clearly. Most black pilots fly thousands of entirely ordinary, uneventful flights across their careers, landing safely and competently every single time, with no crisis available to crack open the assumptions of passengers like the pre-emergency version of Dorothy Vance, which means those passengers very often disembark, having received no correction at all, free to carry their unexamined prejudice into the next jet bridge, the next cockpit, the next pilot whose competence they will doubt on sight, regardless of how flawlessly the flight actually proceeds. Elias Coker's story contains an emergency dramatic enough to force a reckoning. Most stories like his do not. And the absence of that forcing mechanism does not mean the underlying competence is any less real or any less consistently demonstrated. It simply means the passengers carrying unexamined bias rarely receive the kind of evidence this particular story provided. And continue, flight after flight, unaware of exactly how wrong they have been about exactly how many capable people. This matters because it reframes the entire moral weight of this story. The lesson is not wait for proof before judging, because that framing still implicitly excuses the initial judgment as reasonable until disproven. The actual lesson, the harder and more honest one, is that the proof was never actually required in the first place, that a uniform as certification, a title earned through identical, rigorous standards applied to everyone regardless of race, should have been sufficient evidence on its own. In the jet bridge, before any emergency ever tested it, Dorothy Vance's transformation is moving precisely because it shows a person finally arriving at a conclusion she should have started from. It is not a story that validates waiting for proof. It is a story about the cost of having required proof that should never have been demanded in the first place. Elias Coker continued flying for the airline for the remaining years of his career, never seeking promotion into management or training roles that would have removed him from the cockpit, for reasons that echo precisely the reasoning of countless professionals across countless fields, who discover that the specific work they are uniquely suited for matters more to them than any advancement that would take them away from doing it directly. He did, eventually, accept an invitation to serve on the airline's pilot recruitment and mentorship committee, working specifically to identify and support promising young pilots from backgrounds historically underrepresented in commercial aviation. Drawing directly on his own hard-won understanding of exactly what additional barriers those pilots would likely face across their careers, regardless of their actual competence. I tell every young pilot I mentor the same thing, he has said. In interviews conducted years after the flight, this story describes, which is that the job requires you to be twice as good and twice as calm as anyone sitting beside you. Not because that's fair, because it absolutely is not fair, but because that is the actual terrain you're going to be flying through for your entire career. And pretending otherwise does you no favors. The good news, if there is good news in that unfairness, is that twice as good and twice as calm is genuinely achievable through exactly the kind of rigorous, unglamorous practice that good pilots of every background have always needed anyway. The unfairness is real. So is your capacity to meet it? He has also said, more quietly, in conversations with colleagues who have asked him directly about Dorothy Vance and the jet bridge encounter that opened this particular story, that he does not carry the moment with bitterness. Though he understands completely why someone hearing the story secondhand might expect him to, I've had 100 jet bridge moments like that one across 23 years, he has said. Most of them didn't end in a hydraulic failure and a tearful apology in a gate area. Most of them just ended with the passenger landing safely, disembarking, and going on with their day having learned nothing at all, their assumption fully intact, ready to be deployed again on the next captain who happened to look like me. Dorothy's story is unusual, specifically because the emergency forced a reckoning most passengers never get forced into. I don't resent her for needing that forcing. I resent, a little, that the forcing was ever necessary at all, that simple. Sustained competence, demonstrated flight after flight, year after year, wasn't sufficient on its own. But I've made my peace with the fact that this industry, like most industries, sometimes only learns its hardest lessons through crisis. And my job, regardless of what any individual passenger believes about me before boarding, is simply to keep being exactly as competent and exactly as calm as the job requires. Every single time, whether or not anyone watching is paying close enough attention to notice. Theo Coker, now 13 in this story's furthest accounting of him, has begun, in earnest. The early steps toward the aviation career he announced wanting, on his father's driveway, ground school materials his father has begun sharing with him. A series of introductory flights in a small training aircraft arranged through a family friend. The specific, careful excitement of a child discovering that a long-held dream might actually be achievable rather than merely aspirational. He has also begun, in the particular way that children of public-facing parents sometimes do, to ask harder questions about the specific challenges his father has faced across a career that Theo is only now old enough to fully understand was shaped by more than simple meritocracy. "Does it ever make you angry?" Theo asked him once, having read, with his father's permission, an article describing some of the historical discrimination black pilots had faced in the industry, including a brief mention of Marcus Holloway's career that a journalist had included after interviewing Dorothy Vance for a feature on her training panel work. Sometimes, Elias admitted, less often now than it used to. But yes, sometimes, I try not to let the anger become the main thing I carry. Though, because I've watched what happens to people who let old unfairness calcify into permanent bitterness. And it costs them more than it ever costs the people who wronged them. I'd rather spend my energy being excellent at the job and mentoring the next generation of pilots who'll face some version of what I faced, than spend it nursing a grievance that doesn't actually change anything for anybody. But it's okay to be angry sometimes? It's more than okay. It's honest. The danger isn't feeling the anger. The danger is building your whole identity around it, instead of using it as fuel for something that actually moves you and the people coming after you forward. Elias considered his son for a moment. You're going to face some version of this too. Theo, if you become a pilot, maybe less of it than I faced. Because some doors have opened wider since I started. But probably not. None of it. I want you ready for that. The same way I want you ready for an actual hydraulic failure. Not scared of it. Just trained for it. So the training can carry you through it instead of the fear taking the controls. This story is fiction. Elias Coker and Theo and Renee and every passenger named in these pages, Dorothy Vance, Gregory Hutchins, Janelle and Marcus Whitfield, Bethany Cross, Charles Pruitt, Walter Brennan, Marcus Holloway, every one of them lives only here, in these pages. And here's the thing this story most wants you to carry. The part that is sharper and more specific than Times Be Kind. Dorothy Vance was not a cartoon villain. And her transformation was not produced by Elias Coker performing extraordinary kindness toward her. It was produced by reality itself, by the simple, undeniable fact of his demonstrated competence under genuine pressure. A fact that had been equally true and equally demonstrable before the emergency ever began. Sitting entirely unexamined behind her contempt in the jet bridge. The captain capable of bringing a hydraulically compromised aircraft to a safe landing was already in the jet bridge hours earlier. Exactly that, capable. Nothing about his competence changed between the boarding gate and the runway. What changed was only Dorothy's willingness, under the specific duress of genuine fear, to finally see what had been true the entire time. There is a harder truth braided into this one that deserves its own careful statement. The fact that Dorothy eventually saw clearly does not undo the cost of her not seeing clearly sooner. Elias Coker still had to stand in that jet bridge, hours before any emergency tested him, and absorb a stranger's contempt about his fitness to do a job he had spent 23 years and 11,000 flight hours mastering. The eventual apology, however genuine, does not erase that earlier cost. It simply means the relationship between the two of them did not end at the contempt, which is a meaningfully better outcome than the alternative, but is not the same as the contempt never having happened at all. This distinction matters because it resists the comfortable narrative arc that turns every act of prejudice into eventual redemption, as though the redemption retroactively justifies or balances the original harm. It does not. The harm was real when it happened. Regardless of what came after, the redemption is also real and worth honoring. But the two facts coexist rather than canceling each other out. That is the question this story leaves you with. More than any other, how many people in your own life are you evaluating not on the evidence actually available to you, but on assumptions built from a lifetime of unexamined pattern matching that you have never once stopped to interrogate? And what would it take? Must it really take a hydraulic failure, a genuine emergency, something dramatic enough to finally crack the disguise of reasonable caution for you to examine those assumptions before the moment of crisis forces the examination on you? The cost of examining them now, in the calm, ordinary hours before any crisis arrives, is so much smaller than the cost of examining them only once. Fear has stripped away every comfortable justification you had been using to avoid the harder, earlier look. There is a second, quieter question braided into the first, one that belongs specifically to anyone who has ever occupied a position similar to Elias Coker's, required to demonstrate competence that should be assumed, simply because of how they look, performing a role others perform without that additional burden. What does it cost, across a 23-year career, to carry that additional weight? Flight after flight, jet bridge after jet bridge, with no guarantee that any individual passenger's prejudice will ever crack open into the kind of clarity Dorothy Vance eventually reached? Elias Coker has built, by every account this story can offer, a genuinely good life. On the other side of that, cost a son he is raising with the same careful seriousness his own losses taught him. A career he has excelled at by every objective measure. A peace with the unfairness that does not require pretending the unfairness isn't real. But the cost is still real, still paid, still extracted from him, and from every pilot like him, on every ordinary flight that never produces a dramatic emergency capable of correcting anyone's prejudice. If this story moves you to extend more immediate trust to the next professional you encounter, who must work twice as hard for half the automatic credit, let it also move you to consider what it would mean to extend that trust before any crisis demands it of you, rather than waiting for the kind of proof this story happened to provide. If this moved you, tell me in the comments about a moment when circumstance forced you to confront an assumption you had been carrying, unexamined, for far too long, and what it cost you, or finally taught you to see clearly. Say their name if the person deserves to be remembered. Tell me, too, about a Marcus Holloway in your own life or in your own field, someone whose competence the world made them fight twice as hard to prove. And what became of their fight? Share this with somebody who needs the reminder that competence does not announce itself by satisfying anyone's prior expectations, that it simply is what it is. Whether or not we extend it, the credit it has already, quietly, earned. And subscribe, because there is always another jet bridge, another cockpit, another person deciding too quickly who is sitting in the seat in front of them, and somebody has to be the one who flies the aircraft home safely anyway. Every single time, for no reason except that it is, in the end, the whole job that competence and character actually require of any of us. At 35,000 feet, or anywhere else we happen to be tested, there is one more thing worth telling, and it belongs at the very end, because it returns this story to the small folded photograph clipped to a flight bag where it began, 2 years after the flight, this story describes. Elias Coker was asked to speak at his own son's school during a career day event about what it actually meant to fly commercial aircraft for a living. He brought, among the usual props a pilot brings to such an event, a captain's hat, as the children were allowed to try on. A laminated diagram of cockpit instruments, the same worn photograph that had ridden clipped to his flight bag for over a decade. And he held it up for the room of 11-year-olds and told them, plainly, the actual lesson he wanted them to take from his career. "This is my son," he said, "and I touch this picture before every single flight I fly, because it reminds me, in the seconds before I walk through that cockpit door, exactly who I'm trying to come home to, and exactly what kind of man I need to be on the other side of that door to actually make it home to him. Some of you are going to grow up and do jobs where people doubt you before you've said a single word, the way some passengers have doubted me across my career. Simply because of how you look, sitting in the seat you've worked your whole life to earn. I want you to know something important about that. The doubt doesn't change what's true. It only changes how hard you have to work to get people to see what was true the entire time. Do the work anyway. Be excellent anyway. Carry your own photograph, whatever that means. For each of you, the thing that reminds you who you're trying to be, regardless of who's watching or what they've already decided about you before you've had the chance to show them otherwise. Tao, sitting in the audience with his classmates, would later tell his father that this was the exact moment he decided. With the specific total conviction of an 11-year-old finally articulating something he had been circling for years, that he wanted to fly airplanes for the rest of his life, not because of the planes themselves, though he loved those too, but because he wanted to carry forward exactly the kind of quiet, demonstrated, unanswerable competence he had watched his father build, flight after flight, year after year. Regardless of who doubted it at the gate, this story is fiction. Every name and every flight invented for the purpose of this telling. But the photograph clipped to a flight bag, the jet bridge full of unexamined assumption, the hydraulic warning light that does not care what color the hands are on the controls, the long methodical checklist that asks only for competence and gives no quarter to prejudice, all of that is simply the architecture of an industry and a country, still working out exactly how to extend, automatically and without requiring proof, the basic trust that every demonstrated expert has already, quietly, earned. Until that work is finished, there will be more jet bridges like the one this story opened with. More captains required to prove twice what should be assumed once. And more Dorothy Vances who will need, or who will be spared, the need for their own version of a hydraulic failure before they finally see clearly what was true the entire time. Fly safe, wherever your own jet bridge takes you today. And the next time you find yourself sizing up the person about to be responsible for your safety, your case, your surgery, your child's classroom, or any other position requiring trust you have not yet verified, ask yourself, honestly, whether the doubt you're feeling is actually evidence, or whether it is simply the comfortable disguise that prejudice wears when it does not want to be examined. The answer to that question, asked early and asked honestly, is worth considerably more than any apology offered only after the proof has been forced upon you by circumstance. There is a coda to Marcus Holloway's story worth telling in fuller detail, because Dorothy Vance's brief account of him in the gate area conversation only sketched the outline of a career that deserves more complete telling, and because Elias Coker, in the months following the flight, found himself sufficiently moved by Dorothy's account that he tracked down Holloway's contact information through a mutual connection in the pilots' union and reached out directly, an act that produced one of the more unexpected friendships of Elias's later career. Marcus Holloway, by then 74 years old and many years retired, was initially startled and then deeply moved to receive a call from a captain he had never met, describing a conversation Dorothy Vance had had about him in an airport gate area hundreds of miles away. The two men spoke for nearly 2 hours on that first call, Holloway sharing details of his career that Dorothy's account had only gestured toward the specific Czech airman who had failed him on a fabricated technicality. The senior captains who had refused to fly with him during his early years and had to be specifically scheduled around by an operations department, uncomfortable with the obvious pattern, but unwilling to confront it directly. The eventual decision to leave for a regional carrier that Holloway described even decades later, with the specific relief of a man who had finally found a workplace willing to simply let him do his job without constant additional scrutiny. "I want you to understand something," Holloway told Elias. "In that first long conversation, I don't regret leaving. The regional carrier gave me 22 more years of genuinely happy flying. Fair treatment. Real respect for my colleagues. But I think about, sometimes, what it would have meant if the flagship carrier had simply seen me clearly from the start, the way it apparently sees you now. Not because my career would have been better, I'm honestly not sure it would have been, given how that company's culture actually worked in those years, but because of what it would have meant for every black pilot who came after me, watching whether the company that trained them was actually capable of treating them fairly. You being where you are now, doing what you did on that flight, flying for that same company that once made men like me fight for every inch that matters, in a way I don't think the company itself has ever fully reckoned with." Elias and Holloway maintained their friendship in the years following that first call, meeting periodically when their respective travels allowed. And Holloway, at Elias' invitation, eventually joined Dorothy Vance's training panel discussions on several occasions. The unlikely trio, the retired pilot who had been failed by the system, the retired ground operations employee who had absorbed and perpetuated some of that system's worst assumptions without recognizing it, and the active captain whose own emergency had finally forced a reckoning neither of the other two had anticipated, needing presenting together a more complete picture of how prejudice operates across an entire industry and across an entire career than any single account could have provided alone. "The three of us are an uncomfortable trio to put in one room," Holloway said at one such panel, with the dry humor that had apparently served him well across a long and occasionally difficult career. "I'm the man the system failed. She's the woman who watched it fail me and absorbed the wrong lesson from watching. He's the man who finally forced the lesson to correct itself, more or less by accident, because his airplane happened to break in a way that demanded everyone in that cabin finally pay proper attention to what was actually true. None of us asked for this particular configuration of history to land us in the same room together. But I think it's a better room for all three of us being in it. And I think the people listening get something out of hearing all three angles that they wouldn't get from any single one of us telling our piece alone." The hydraulic emergency itself, in the months following the flight, became the subject of a detailed internal investigation by both the airline and federal aviation authorities. Standard procedure for any non-normal landing of this severity. And the investigation's conclusions, released several months later, provided additional vindication of exactly the kind Dorothy Vance had witnessed firsthand. The root cause was identified as a manufacturing defect in a hydraulic line seal, unrelated to maintenance practices or crew error. And the investigation specifically commended the flight crew's handling of the emergency as exemplary execution of established, non-normal procedures under genuine system degradation. Language that closely echoed the tower controller's own informal assessment in the immediate aftermath. Priya Raman, Elias's first officer that day, was promoted to captain herself within 18 months. A promotion she would later say had been meaningfully accelerated by the demonstrated composure and skill she had shown during the emergency. Skill she credited directly to having trained under Elias's mentorship in the months leading up to the flight. He drilled emergency procedures with me more rigorously than any captain I'd flown with before him, she said, in an interview conducted for an aviation industry publication profiling the incident. Not because he expected anything like what actually happened, but because his whole philosophy was that you train as though the worst day is coming, so that when some version of it actually does come, you're not improvising. You're simply executing what you've already rehearsed 100 times. That training is the entire reason I was able to read that left main gear checklist clean, without a single hesitation, while my hands were shaking just as much as his were. Janelle Whitfield's advocacy work with the airline, mentioned earlier in this account, deserves fuller telling as well, because the structural change it eventually produced extended well beyond the weighted blankets and noise-canceling headphones that became standard fleet equipment. Working with the airline's customer experience and crew training departments over the following 2 years, Janelle helped develop an entirely new training module, specifically addressing how flight crews should support neurodivergent passengers and their families during in-flight distress, not merely tolerating such passengers as an unfortunate inconvenience to be minimized. The framing Charles Pruitt had brought to his own initial reaction, but actively understanding the specific sensory and communication needs that could transform a difficult flight into a manageable one. Given the right crew response, I didn't set out to become an advocate, Janelle said. In a profile the airline eventually published as part of its broader diversity and inclusion materials, I set out, on that one flight, simply trying to get my son through a difficult few hours without anyone making it worse for him. But Marisol Vega showed me something that day, that the right response wasn't complicated or expensive. It just required someone willing to actually understand what Marcus needed, instead of assuming his distress was a discipline problem to be managed or punished. I wanted to make sure other families got that same understanding without having to get lucky with which specific flight attendant happened to be working their flight that day. I wanted it to be the standard, not the exception. The training module Janelle helped develop is now mandatory for all new flight attendant hires across the airline, and has been cited, in subsequent industry surveys, as a model that several competing carriers have since adapted for their own training programs. A small but concrete piece of structural change that traces its entire origin back to one difficult flight and one mother's refusal to let her son's distress go unaddressed by the systems meant to serve him. Renee Coker's own story deserves fuller telling here as well, because the woman Elias lost shaped, in ways that extended well beyond simple grief, the specific philosophy of attentive presence that he would later bring to his cockpit and to every interaction with a frightened or struggling passenger. She had taught high school chemistry for 9 years before her death, at a school in a working-class neighborhood that other teachers in the district considered a difficult assignment, full of students whose home lives made consistent academic focus genuinely hard to sustain. And Renee had built, across those 9 years, a reputation among her students as the one teacher who actually noticed when something outside the classroom was affecting their ability to learn inside it. She used to tell me, Elias has said, in occasional interviews where he discusses his late wife's influence on his own approach to his work, that the worst thing a teacher could do was assume a struggling student was simply lazy or uninterested, because 9 times out of 10, something else entirely was actually going on: hunger, instability at home, an undiagnosed learning difficulty nobody had bothered to investigate, and the job of a good teacher was to stay curious about the actual cause instead of settling for the easiest, most judgmental explanation. I think about that constantly now. In the cockpit and in the cabin, both, every difficult passenger, every tense moment, there's almost always something underneath the surface behavior that a little curiosity would reveal, if you're willing to look past the easiest explanation to the real one. Renee's former students, several of whom remained in occasional contact with Elias across the years following her death. Established. On the 5th anniversary of her passing, a small scholarship fund in her name at the school where she had taught, specifically supporting students facing the kind of outside-the-classroom instability that Renee had spent her career learning to recognize and address with patience rather than judgment. Elias has attended the scholarship's annual award ceremony every year since its founding, bringing Theo along as he's grown old enough to understand the significance. The two of them sitting in a high school auditorium each year, watching a new graduating class produce students who had been seen properly by an institution that Renee had spent 9 years quietly teaching to see more clearly. Bethany Cross's recovery from her flight anxiety, mentioned briefly earlier in this account, took a turn that deserves fuller telling, because it eventually led her back into direct contact with the flight crew who had handled her panic attack with such careful skill. 18 months after completing her fear of flying course and successfully resuming air travel, Bethany found herself, through the specific coincidence that long careers in any industry eventually produce, seated on a flight crewed by Marisol Vega herself, an encounter that Bethany initially almost let pass without comment. Embarrassed by the memory of her own panic attack and uncertain whether Marisol would even remember a single passenger out of the thousands she had served across her career, she worked up the courage, near the end of the flight, to approach Marisol during the final cabin check and said, somewhat awkwardly, "I don't know if you'll remember me. I had a panic attack on a flight about 18 months ago, during an emergency diversion. You talked me through it." Marisol's face had changed immediately. The specific recognition of a professional who genuinely did remember. Despite the volume of passengers her career had put in front of her, Bethany, "Of course I remember. How are you doing? You're flying again. That's wonderful to see. I took a fear of flying course after that flight." Bethany said, "I think about what you said to me constantly. Actually, that what was happening was the system working exactly the way it was supposed to work. Not evidence that anything was actually going wrong with the flight itself. I'd never thought about turbulence or mechanical alerts that way before. I'd always just assumed any indication of a problem meant catastrophe was imminent. You taught me, in like 20 minutes during the scariest experience of my life, to think about it completely differently. That makes me happier than you probably realize." Marisol said, "Most of the time, in this job, we help someone through a hard moment, and then they disembark, and we never know what happened next. Getting to see the after, getting to see that it actually mattered past that one flight that's rare. And it means a lot." The two women exchanged contact information, an unusual but not unprecedented occurrence in an industry that occasionally produces these kinds of genuine connections between crew and passengers, and have remained in loose touch since. Bethany periodically updating Marisol on her continued comfort with flying, including 2 years after their reunion, a message describing her first solo international trip, a milestone that would have been unimaginable to the woman who had once needed grounding techniques simply to survive a domestic flight without a full breakdown. Walter Brennan, the elderly widower flying to his granddaughter's wedding, deserves his own fuller accounting as well, because the conversation he had with Marisol Vega early in the flight, before the hydraulic emergency overtook the narrative of that day, produced consequences that rippled forward through his family in ways neither he nor Marisol could have anticipated. He made it to the wedding, eventually, on a replacement flight the following morning. Having spent an unplanned night in a hotel near the diversion airport, courtesy of the airline's standard accommodation policy for passengers affected by mechanical delays, he arrived at the wedding venue with considerably less time to compose himself than he had originally planned, but with, by his own later account to his daughter, a meaningfully different internal state than the rigid, grief-frozen man who had boarded the original flight, the conversation with Marisol having given him, in those 20 minutes over the original flight's first hour, permission to actually name and sit with his grief, rather than simply suppress it through the wedding, which had been his original plan. I almost didn't go at all. Walter confided to his daughter, Walter's late wife's sister. At the reception, I kept thinking I'd just fall apart standing there, surrounded by everyone. The empty space where your mother should have been impossible to ignore. But that flight attendant, on the original flight, before all the trouble with the plane started, she asked me what was actually on my mind. Instead of just leaving me alone with it the way most people do, and something about actually saying it out loud, even to a stranger, even just for 20 minutes, made the weight of it considerably more bearable by the time I actually got here. He gave a brief, unplanned toast at the reception, departing from his prepared remarks to speak, briefly and with visible emotion, about his late wife's specific delight in weddings, her habit of crying happily at every single one, regardless of how distantly she was related to the couple, and the particular ache of attending this one, without her a toast that several family members later described as the most genuinely moving moment of the entire reception, precisely because it did not pretend the grief wasn't present, simply made room for it, alongside the joy the occasion was meant to hold. He wrote to the airline several weeks later, a brief but heartfelt letter specifically praising Marisol Vega's attentiveness, noting that her 20 minutes of genuine conversation had likely made the difference between his arriving at his granddaughter's wedding, able to participate fully in the joy of the occasion, and arriving rigid with unaddressed grief that would have cast a shadow over an event meant to celebrate new beginnings. I am 83 years old, he wrote, and I have flown perhaps 200 times across my life, served by hundreds of flight attendants whose names I could not begin to recall. I will remember this one for the rest of whatever years I have left, because she did the one thing that actually mattered on that particular afternoon. She noticed an old man was not all right, and she stayed long enough to find out why. There is, finally, a question this story has been circling without fully naming directly, and it deserves to be asked plainly before this account reaches its close. What is it exactly that allows certain people, Elias Coker in his cockpit, Marisol Vega in her cabin, David Okafor stepping forward from coach to assist a stranger's cardiac emergency, to extend this kind of sustained, attentive care to person after person, crisis after crisis, across a single demanding day, without the well of their own capacity for it running dry? The honest answer, drawn from everything this story has tried to show across its considerable length, is not some innate, unlimited reservoir of selflessness that some people simply possess and others lack. It is, instead, a specific and learnable discipline, built through training, through example, through the hard, private work of processing one's own griefs and fears thoroughly enough that they do not leak uncontrolled into every subsequent interaction with a stranger in crisis. Elias Coker did not arrive at his calm, methodical handling of a hydraulic emergency by accident. He built it through 23 years of deliberate training, through the specific discipline of treating every simulator session as though the stakes were real, through the harder private work of grieving his wife fully enough that her loss became a source of empathy rather than an unprocessed wound that might have made him brittle or reactive under the exact kind of pressure this flight delivered. Marisol Vega did not develop her skill at de-escalating Charles Pruitt's hostility or grounding Bethany Cross's panic by some natural gift alone. She built it through years of deliberate attention to exactly these kinds of moments, through training her own instinct to kneel rather than loom, to ask rather than assume, to stay curious about the cause underneath difficult behavior rather than settling for the easiest judgmental explanation. This matters because it means the capacity this story has spent its entire length describing is not reserved for some rare and exceptional class of person. It is available, in principle, to anyone willing to do the specific, unglamorous work of building it, processing their own griefs honestly rather than letting them calcify into reactive defensiveness, training their own instincts toward curiosity rather than judgment, practicing the specific discipline of staying calm and present in moments that would tempt a less prepared person toward panic or dismissal. Dorothy Vance, by the end of this story, had begun exactly this kind of work herself, examining an assumption she had carried unexamined for 31 years and choosing, deliberately, to carry the correction forward into every subsequent training session she conducted. That work is available to every person reading this account, regardless of whether their own life ever delivers a hydraulic emergency dramatic enough to force the examination. As urgently as this particular story's events forced it for Dorothy, there is one final image worth leaving you with, one Elias has described. On the rare occasions he speaks publicly about that flight, as the thing he thinks about most when the demands of the job feel heavier than they should. It is not the hydraulic checklist, and it is not Dorothy's apology in the gate area, and it is not even the moment his hands finally trembled once the danger had passed. It is a moment near the very end of that long, eventful day. Standing on the tarmac beside the grounded aircraft, while maintenance crews began their own careful investigation of the failed hydraulic system. When Elias glanced toward the terminal and saw, through a window, the gate area full of his displaced passengers, Dorothy Vance speaking quietly with Janelle Whitfield. The two of them apparently having struck up a conversation while waiting for rebooking information. Gregory Hutchins's family having rushed to the hospital, visible briefly through another window, embracing him as he was wheeled toward treatment. Walter Brennan sitting quietly with a cup of coffee. His earlier rigid stillness now replaced with something closer to peace. That image stays with me. Elias has said, because it's the part of the job nobody puts in the training manual, not the technical execution of the emergency, which is important and which I trained for relentlessly. But the simple fact that an aircraft is never just a machine carrying cargo from one point to another. It's 186 entire lives, each one carrying something invisible. Each one connected by nothing more than the coincidence of having bought a ticket for the same afternoon. My job, in the narrowest technical sense, is to fly the machine safely. But the actual job, the fuller one, is to remember, every single time, that the machine is simply the vessel carrying all of that invisible human weight, and that the safe landing matters because of what it protects, not merely because it satisfies the certification standard. He thinks, too, often, about the specific irony of how that particular day unfolded, that the very emergency which forced Dorothy Vance to finally see his competence clearly was also, simultaneously, the thing that nearly cost Gregory Hutchins his life through delay. Had the diversion happened to land somewhere without adequate cardiac care available, and was also, somehow, in the strange compressed geography of human crisis, occurring at the exact same moment that Janelle Whitfield was managing her son's sensory distress 3 rows back, and Walter Brennan was finally finding words for his grief, and Bethany Cross was discovering that her fear, however real, was not a reliable predictor of actual danger. Every single person on that flight thought they were having their own private crisis, completely separate from everyone else's. Elias has said, none of them knew, in the moment, how many other private crises were unfolding simultaneously. 18 inches away in either direction. I think that's true of every flight. Honestly, every single day. Whether or not a hydraulic system happens to fail, we're all sealed into our own private oceans of difficulty, sitting right next to someone else's, the job, the whole job, the only job that's ever actually mattered, is being willing to notice that everyone's ocean is right there, adjacent to everyone else's, and being willing to kneel down in any one of them when it's called for. 7 incidents, 1 flight, 1 man who already knew exactly who he was before any of them began, and who passed that knowing on. 1 calm checklist and 1 kneeling conversation at a time. To everyone fortunate enough to be aboard his particular aircraft on the worst and strangest day of an entirely ordinary scheduled route, if there is a single sentence this entire story has been trying to hand you. Across every checklist item, every kneeling conversation, every difficult exchange in a jet bridge or a gate area, it is this one, worth carrying with you long after you have closed this page and returned to whatever ordinary flight or ordinary day you were living before you started reading. Decide who you are going to be before the moment that tests it ever arrives. Because the moment will not wait for you to figure it out in real time. And the people, depending on you when it comes, will only ever get the version of you that you already quietly, privately decided to become long before they ever boarded your particular aircraft at all. Decide now. Decide before the next flight, the next jet bridge, the next stranger whose competence you are tempted to doubt on sight. Then simply keep being that person. Checklist after checklist, crossing after crossing. For as long as anyone needs you to. That is what Elias Coker's father taught him, without ever fully knowing he was teaching it. In the specific philosophy that practice is what you do when nobody's watching. So the performance takes care of itself when everybody finally is. That is what Rene Coker taught generations of struggling students. Staying curious about the cause underneath difficult behavior rather than settling for the easiest judgmental explanation. That is what Elias Coker is now teaching his own son. In the quieter curriculum of simply living his values in front of him every single day. Checklist by checklist. Jet bridge by jet bridge. And that is what this story, in its own small way, has been trying to teach you too. That competence does not need anyone's belief to be real, but that the cost of withholding belief from competence that has already, quietly, proven itself is a cost paid disproportionately by exactly the people who can least afford to keep paying it. Flight after flight, for an entire career, waiting for the hydraulic failure that finally forces the world to see what was true all along. Thank you for staying with this story all the way to its final approach. There are more flights like this one happening right now, carrying captains and crew members and passengers whose names you will never learn. Each of them deciding, in their own small, unwitnessed way, who they are going to be the next time a stranger needs them to be it. Or the next time a stranger's unexamined assumption needs correcting before crisis forces the correction. Some of them will examine the assumption early, in the calm, ordinary hours before any testing comes. Some of them, like Dorothy Vance, will need a genuine emergency to finally crack the disguise of reasonable caution wide enough to let the truth through. Build, in your own life. The habit of examining your assumptions before crisis forces the examination because the examination is always available to you, in the calm, ordinary hours. For anyone willing to look honestly at the evidence already sitting in front of them, fly safe, wherever your own jet bridge takes you today. And the next time you find yourself sizing up the person responsible for your safety, your case, your surgery, your child's classroom, or any other position, requiring trust. You have not yet personally verified. Ask yourself, honestly, whether the doubt you are feeling is actually evidence, or whether it is simply the comfortable disguise that prejudice wears when it does not want to be examined. The answer to that question, asked early and asked honestly, is worth considerably more than any apology offered only after the proof has been forced upon you by circumstance. A final note on the manifest of that particular flight. The simple administrative document listing every passenger aboard, ordinarily attracting no attention beyond the crew, checking names against boarding passes. Looking back at it now, the names read like a strange constellation. Dorothy Vance in 3A. Gregory Hutchins several rows back. Janelle and Marcus Whitfield near the rear galley. Bethany Cross, somewhere in the middle cabin. Walter Brennan in row Elf. Charles Pruitt directly behind the Whitfields before his relocation. 186 people who boarded as complete strangers to one another, occupying the ordinary geography of an aircraft cabin, each carrying a private weight invisible to everyone seated around them. None of them imagining, as they settled into their assigned seats and stowed their assigned bags, that the afternoon ahead would test every single one of them, in different and overlapping ways, through the unglamorous intervention of a flight crew doing their jobs with more care than the job technically required. That, perhaps, is the final image this story wants to leave you with, a printed manifest. A list of seat numbers and surnames, utterly unremarkable on its surface, containing within it an entire hidden architecture of human crisis and competence that no administrative document could ever capture, waiting only for someone willing to look past the seat assignments and actually see the people sitting in them, and willing too to extend automatically and without requiring proof the basic trust that the person in the captain's seat has already, quietly, earned through 23 years and 11,000 flight hours of exactly this kind of demonstrated, unglamorous, life or death competence. Every flight you have ever taken has been exactly this kind of manifest, a list of strangers, each carrying something you cannot see, each one a complete and complicated life compressed temporarily into a single assigned seat, trusting, whether they think about it consciously or not, that the person at the front of the aircraft has already decided, long before this particular flight, exactly who they were going to be when the testing came. Most of the time, the testing never arrives in a form dramatic enough to prove it one way or the other. The trust simply has to be extended anyway, in advance, on the strength of the uniform and the certification, and the simple fact that the standards required to earn both apply equally to everyone who has ever worn them, regardless of what any individual passenger has decided before boarding about who belongs in that seat. Decide to extend that trust before the testing comes. It is, in the end, the cheapest and most valuable thing any of us will ever have the chance to give a stranger at 35,000 feet. In a jet bridge, or anywhere else, two people happen to find their fates, briefly, unexpectedly, intertwined. A small accounting, finally, of what this story has tried to be, separate from the entertainment of its individual incidents. It has tried to honor a profession too often reduced, in public imagination, to the brief and transactional moments passengers actually witness the boarding announcement, the safety briefing, the gentle bump of wheels meeting runway while leaving entirely invisible, the considerably larger and harder work that profession actually demands of the people inside it, years of rigorous training, the constant maintenance of split-second readiness for emergencies that may never come, and for pilots who do not fit the unexamined image some passengers still carry of who belongs in a cockpit. an additional and entirely unearned burden of having to demonstrate repeatedly a competence that should be assumed the moment the uniform and the four stripes are visible. It has tried, too, to honor the specific and compounded difficulty faced by a black man performing that labor in an industry whose own history, as Dorothy Vance and Marcus Holloway's accounts make plain, has not always extended fair treatment to the people who have nonetheless mastered every standard the industry itself established. And it has tried, last and perhaps most importantly, to honor the particular unglamorous heroism of single fatherhood, not the dramatic, cinematic version that makes for easy inspiration, but the actual daily architecture of it, the sleepless nights managed alone, the careful balance between a demanding career and a child who needs presence as much as provision, the photograph touched before every flight as a way of remembering exactly who you are trying to remain, regardless of what the next several hours happen to ask of you. If even one person reading this finishes it and decides to extend a pilot, a surgeon, a single parent, or any other quietly scrutinized professional in their own life, slightly more automatic trust than they might have extended yesterday, slightly more willingness to assume competence rather than demand its proof, slightly more curiosity about the assumptions they are carrying unexamined into their own version of a jet bridge than this story. Whatever its length and whatever its particular fictional configuration of crises, will have done the only job it was ever actually trying to do. Thank you for flying with this story all the way to its final approach. Wherever your next crossing takes you, may you find, waiting at the front of the aircraft, exactly the kind of steady, demonstrated competence this story has spent its considerable length trying to describe, and may you be willing, the next time a jet bridge or a boardroom or a classroom hands you the chance, to extend that trust before the proof is forced upon you by circumstance. A final postscript. For those who have read this far and find themselves wondering what became of the maintenance investigation into the hydraulic failure itself, the manufacturer of the affected component, once the federal investigation's findings were released, issued a service bulletin to every airline operating aircraft with the same hydraulic line seal, recommending inspection and, where necessary, replacement across the entire affected fleet, a direct structural consequence of one flight's mechanical failure, ensuring that the specific defect responsible for Elias Coker's emergency would not produce the same crisis for another crew, another captain, another plane load of passengers somewhere else in the world. It is a small and unglamorous fact, buried in technical bulletins that almost no passenger will ever read. And it represents, in its own quiet way, exactly the kind of systemic correction this entire story has been arguing for throughout its length. Not merely individual reckoning, however moving, but structural change that protects the next person and the next, long after the individual story that prompted it has been forgotten by everyone except the people who lived through it. That is, perhaps, the final and most important lesson available in this account: individual transformation, like Dorothy Vance's, matters enormously and deserves to be honored, but it is not sufficient on its own. The training modules Janelle Whitfield helped build, the service bulletin the hydraulic manufacturer issued, the mentorship committee Elias Coker joined to support the next generation of pilots facing what he faced. These structural changes are what actually protect the people who will never get the dramatic, forcing emergency this particular flight happened to produce. Individual hearts changing is moving. Systems changing is what actually scales that change to everyone who will never personally witness the moment that produced it. The end. If this story stayed with you, share it with someone who flies often, someone who works in a field where their competence is too often questioned before it's demonstrated, or someone who simply needs reminding that the quiet, rigorous mastery surrounding us every day is rarely as simple or as replaceable as a moment's unexamined assumption suggests. Say the names of the people who have earned trust they were nonetheless made to fight for. They deserve to be remembered, even especially when their competence asks for nothing in return except the basic, automatic credit that competence has always, in any fair accounting, deserved. Safe travels, and thank you for reading all the way to the final approach. One more small thing. Before the cabin lights finally come up for good on this particular story, Elias Coker, asked once by a journalist writing a piece on representation in commercial aviation what he wanted readers to take away from his particular flight, paused for a long moment before answering, and what he finally said has stayed in the years since. The closest thing this entire story has to a thesis statement spoken in his own voice rather than narrated around him. I want people to understand that the 4 stripes on a captain's shoulder mean exactly the same thing, regardless of whose shoulder they're on. 11,000 flight hours, 23 years of training, the same certification exams, the same rigorous standards, the same check ride evaluations that every single captain in this industry has had to pass to earn that seat. None of that changes based on what the person looks like sitting in it. What changes, for some of us, is how much additional scrutiny we face before passengers are willing to extend the trust that uniform should automatically confer. I want people to ask themselves, the next time they board a flight and clock who's sitting up front, whether their instinctive reaction is actually based on anything real, or whether it's simply the comfortable disguise that old, unexamined assumption wears when it doesn't want to be questioned. The competence is there, the same competence, on every single flight, whether or not any individual passenger is willing to see it clearly. I'd just like more of you to see it clearly before the emergency forces the seeing, rather than after. That is the whole of it. That is the entire story. Fly safe. And remember, the manifest. There is a thing about Theo Coker's growing interest in aviation that deserves one more telling, because it returns this story, fittingly, to the relationship between a father's career and a son's inheritance of its deepest values, rather than merely its surface profession. At 13, Theo had begun attending a youth aviation program on weekends, a structured introduction to flight fundamentals offered through a local chapter of an organization specifically focused on increasing representation among young people from backgrounds historically underrepresented in commercial and general aviation. Elias had not pushed him toward this program. Theo had found it himself, through a classmate whose own father flew for a different airline, and had come home one evening with an application already filled out, asking only for his father's signature and his blessing. "You don't have to do this because of me," Elias told him, signing the form at the kitchen table. "I want you to want this because it's actually what you want, not because you think it's what I want for you." "I know that," Theo said, with the specific patient exasperation of a teenager explaining something to a parent who he feels should already understand it. "I'm not doing it because of you. I'm doing it because of the story you told me about the hydraulic emergency, about how the training cleared everything else out of your head except what the moment needed. I want to know what that feels like. I want to know if I can build that kind of calm in myself, the way you built it in yourself. That's not the same as doing it because of you. That's doing it because of what you taught me is possible." The distinction, Elias would later say, mattered enormously to him, the difference between a son following a father's path simply for lack of any other direction, and a son choosing a path because he had watched, up close, exactly what kind of person that path could help him become, and had decided, independently and with full ownership of the choice, that he wanted to become that kind of person too. Theo completed his first solo flight in a small training aircraft 3 years later. At 16, the minimum age allowed, and Elias stood on the tarmac watching his son taxi out alone for the first time, doing the thing every flight instructor's family member does in that exact moment, which is feel an entire complicated cocktail of pride and terror in roughly equal measure, made considerably more complicated. In Elias's specific case, by the awareness of exactly how much trust he was extending to a 16-year-old's training and judgment. The same kind of trust that strangers extended to him, automatically or otherwise. Every single time they boarded one of his flights, Theo's solo flight was, by every account, entirely uneventful, a smooth takeoff. 3 practice patterns around the airfield, an equally smooth landing, the kind of flight that produces no dramatic story at all. Simply the quiet satisfaction of training translated successfully into independent competence. Elias has said, describing that day, that the uneventfulness was itself the entire point. The thing he wanted most for his son, not a dramatic emergency to prove anything to anyone, simply the steady, demonstrated, unremarkable competence that comes from training taken seriously and executed with care. The same competence that should be sufficient on its own, without requiring any additional crisis to make it visible to a watching world. That's what I actually want for him, Elias has said. Not a hydraulic failure to prove what he's capable of. Just 1,000 ordinary, uneventful flights. Each one quietly. Unremarkably excellent. Each one adding to a record that should speak for itself. To anyone willing to actually look at it honestly, without needing an emergency to force the looking. There is one more small thing worth carrying with you. Before this story finally sets you down, if you have ever sat in a waiting room, a jet bridge, a job interview, or any other threshold moment, wondering what the person across from you might be carrying behind their composed exterior, that wondering is itself worth something, even if you never voice it. Even if the moment passes without either of you acknowledging the assumption, you almost let yourself make the wondering is the beginning of the kind of attention this story has spent its entire length describing. The attention that notices a complete person rather than merely a uniform or a category, that stays curious about the gap between a stranger's surface presentation and the actual demonstrated record sitting available, if you're willing to look for it, just beneath the surface. You will not always know, in the moment, whether you are about to be tested the way Dorothy Vance was tested, forced by genuine emergency into a clarity she had avoided for 31 years. Most days will not deliver that kind of forcing mechanism. Most days will simply ask you, quietly, unglamorously, to choose curiosity over assumption, evidence over pattern matching, the harder and more honest look over the comfortable disguise that prejudice wears when it doesn't want to be examined. And most days, nobody will ever know whether you made that choice well or poorly. Because most days do not produce a hydraulic failure dramatic enough to reveal the answer to anyone watching. Make the choice anyway. Choose it in the calm, ordinary hours, before any crisis arrives to force it. That is the entire and complete inheritance this story has been trying to hand you. Across every checklist, every kneeling conversation, every difficult exchange in a jet bridge or a gate area or a quiet kitchen table where a father teaches his son what 23 years of demonstrated competence actually looks like. Built one ordinary, uneventful, quietly excellent flight at a time. Safe travels, always. And thank you for staying with this long crossing all the way to its final quiet landing. There is, finally, a question worth sitting with after closing this account. What would your own jet bridge conversation have sounded like? Had you been the one standing where Dorothy Vance stood, facing a captain whose stripes and certifications were identical to any other captain's, but whose face triggered before a single word was exchanged? A lifetime of unexamined pattern matching you had never once stopped to interrogate? Most of us would like to believe we would have behaved differently than Dorothy did in that initial jet bridge encounter, extended the automatic trust, skipped the contempt entirely, arrived already at the clarity she only reached after genuine fear forced it upon her. The honest and uncomfortable possibility, the one this story has tried to sit with rather than resolve too easily, is that many of us carry some version of Dorothy's unexamined assumption into our own daily jet bridges, our own version of sizing up a stranger before they've finished a single sentence. And that the only real difference between us and her is whether circumstance ever delivers the kind of forcing emergency that makes the assumption impossible to keep avoiding. That possibility is not meant to produce guilt for its own sake, which rarely changes anything and often simply curdles into defensive denial. It is meant to produce exactly the kind of early, voluntary examination. This entire story has been arguing for the choice to interrogate your own assumptions now, in the calm, ordinary hours, rather than waiting for your own hydraulic failure to force the examination on you. Dorothy Vance got the chance to make that examination only because circumstance handed her an emergency dramatic enough to demand it. Most of us will never get handed quite that dramatic a mirror. We have to choose, instead, to hold the mirror up ourselves, voluntarily, before any crisis arrives to force our hand. That choice, made early and made honestly, is the entire and complete gift this long story has been trying to offer you across every one of its considerable words. Take it with you into your next jet bridge, your next unfamiliar face, your next moment of instinctive, unexamined judgment. The examination costs you almost nothing in the calm, ordinary hours. It costs considerably more, as Dorothy Vance would tell you herself, to wait until fear has stripped away every comfortable justification before finally, belatedly, doing the looking you could have done all along. Fly safe. Examine your assumptions early, and the next time a stranger's competence sits waiting for you to simply extend it the credit it has already, quietly, earned, extend it. Don't wait for the emergency to make you. A coda on Gregory Hutchins, whose cardiac emergency unfolded quietly through the first half of this story before the hydraulic failure overtook the narrative's attention. He returned to work 4 months after his treatment, having made, at his cardiologist's insistence and his own newly sharpened sense of mortality, several significant lifestyle changes he credited directly to the specific terror of believing, for several hours over the middle of the country, that he might be living the final chapter of his father's exact fate at the exact age his father had died. He took up walking, then jogging, then, 18 months later, completed his first half marathon, an achievement he marked by sending Marisol Vega and David Okafor each a photograph of himself crossing the finish line, with a note that read, "In part, I spent 3 years waiting for my heart to fail me the way it failed my father." You two made sure that waiting didn't turn into the ending I was afraid of. I decided, somewhere in my recovery, that I wasn't going to just survive what happened on that flight. I was going to actually change because of it. David Okafor, the physician assistant whose calm, methodical care had managed Gregory's symptoms throughout the flight, found himself, in the months following the incident, reconsidering his own career trajectory entirely. He had been, at the time of the flight, several years into a physician assistant career he found steady but not especially passionate. and the experience of managing a genuine in-flight cardiac emergency. Working in close partnership with flight crew under real pressure and real stakes, reignited an interest in emergency medicine he had set aside years earlier in favor of a more conventional and predictable specialty. He began, within the year, the additional certification process to specialize in emergency and critical care medicine. A career pivot he has directly credited to the specific clarity that single flight produced about what kind of medical work actually engaged him most fully. I'd forgotten, somewhere along the way, why I went into medicine in the first place. David said, in a brief interview conducted for the same aviation industry profile that featured Priya Raman's account of the emergency. That flight reminded me, there's something about the compressed stakes of an actual emergency. The complete focus it demands. That brought back exactly the version of myself I'd lost touch with in a more routine practice. I owe that captain and his crew a debt I don't think they fully realize they're owed, not just for how they handled the mechanical emergency, but for creating the conditions in which I rediscovered what I actually wanted to do with the rest of my career. This is, perhaps, one final and quietly important thing this story wants to leave you with, that the ripples of a single difficult day extend in directions no one involved could have predicted at the time. Reshaping careers, rekindling old passions, prompting structural changes to training programs and equipment manifests, producing friendships between people who would otherwise never have crossed paths, and occasionally, as in Dorothy Vance's case, cracking open assumptions that had calcified across entire decades. None of the people aboard that flight could have known, boarding at the gate that ordinary afternoon, exactly how many of their individual trajectories were about to be permanently altered by the next several hours. That is, perhaps, the truest thing any single flight, examined closely enough, can teach us that we never fully know, in the moment of boarding, exactly which ordinary day is about to become the hinge on which an entire subsequent chapter of our lives will turn. The end. Finally and completely. Thank you for flying this long story all the way to its final approach. Safe travels. And may your own assumptions always meet the evidence early, before any emergency ever has to force the meeting. A final word on the title this story carries, and what it was always meant to evoke beyond the literal jet bridge, where Dorothy Vance's contempt first met Elias Coker's calm refusal to be diminished by it. A jet bridge is, in the most practical sense, simply the enclosed walkway connecting a terminal to an aircraft door. The brief transitional space every passenger crosses without much thought on their way from one fixed point to another. But it is also, fittingly, exactly the kind of threshold space where assumption operates most freely and most dangerously the moment before two strangers have exchanged enough actual information to form a real judgment. When the only available data is surface appearance, and when the temptation to fill that informational gap with pattern matching and prior bias runs highest, precisely because so little real evidence yet exists to contradict it. Every one of us crosses some version of a jet bridge multiple times a day. The threshold moment before a job interview, before a first date, before a new colleague's first meeting, before any encounter with a stranger whose actual character and competence remain, for those first crucial seconds, entirely unverified, and therefore entirely vulnerable to whatever assumption we bring into the crossing. Dorothy Vance's jet bridge happened to be literal, narrated in detail across this story's opening pages, because the literal version offered a clean and vivid frame for examining a pattern that operates everywhere, constantly, mostly invisibly, in every threshold crossing any of us makes in an ordinary day. The question this story has been asking across every one of its considerable words is simply this. What would it take for you to cross your own jet bridges differently? Starting today. Extending automatically. The trust that demonstrated competence and shared certification standards have already quietly earned, rather than waiting for crisis to force the extension upon you. The answer, as this entire account has tried to show, costs you almost nothing in the calm, ordinary hours and saves the person crossing that bridge alongside you from carrying, even briefly, the unearned weight of having to prove what should never have required proving in the first place. Cross your next jet bridge differently. That is the whole and entire ask this long story has been making of you. Patiently, across every checklist and every kneeling conversation and every difficult, honest reckoning it has tried to render in full. Safe travels. Truly, and finally, and thank you for making this entire long crossing with me. The story is complete. There are pilots, captains, surgeon, teachers, and countless other quietly scrutinized professionals crossing their own version of that jet bridge today. Right now, while you read this, demonstrating in ordinary, uneventful moments that will never make any dramatic story. Exactly the competence this entire account has spent its length describing, with no hydraulic failure available to force anyone's recognition of it. They will land their planes, close their cases, finish their procedures, teach their lessons, and go home to whatever family or quiet evening awaits them, having proven nothing new that day, simply having continued, once more, the same demonstrated record of excellence that should have been sufficient evidence from the very beginning. Most of them will never receive Dorothy Vance's apology. Most of them will simply keep doing the work. Flight after flight, day after day, trusting that the record itself, even unwitnessed and uncelebrated, remains true regardless of who is or isn't paying close enough attention to see it. That quiet, unwitnessed consistency is, perhaps, the most genuinely heroic part of this entire story. More heroic in its way than the dramatic hydraulic emergency that gave this particular account its narrative engine. Elias Coker did not become excellent because of one crisis. He had already been excellent. Flight after uneventful flight, for 23 years before that crisis ever arrived to make the excellence visible to a skeptical stranger. The emergency revealed his competence. It did not create it. That distinction, held clearly, is the entire moral center of everything this long story has tried to say. Carry that distinction with you. Extend the trust before the emergency forces it. And to every captain, every surgeon, every teacher, every quietly scrutinized professional reading this who has ever had to prove twice what should have been assumed once, thank you for the work you do anyway. Witnessed or not, believed or not, simply because the work itself, done well, has always been its own complete and sufficient justification. Safe travels. The story, at last, is finished. If you found yourself reading this story, identifying more closely with Elias Coker's experience than with Dorothy Vance's, if you have spent your own career or your own life having to prove repeatedly what should have been assumed once, know that this story was written, in part, for you specifically, as a recognition that the cost you carry is real, is rarely acknowledged adequately by the systems that extract it from you, and does not require anyone else's eventual apology to be valid or to have mattered. You do not need a hydraulic failure to validate your competence. The competence was always real, demonstrated in 1,000 ordinary, unwitnessed moments that never needed a dramatic emergency to prove themselves true. Dorothy Vance's eventual clarity is a gift to her. a chance to correct 3 decades of unexamined assumption. It was never something you owed her, or anyone else, in order for your own excellence to count. And if you found yourself identifying more closely with Dorothy Vance, if you recognized somewhere in her account of watching real discrimination happen to people like Marcus Holloway, and somehow drawing the wrong lesson from the watching, some version of an assumption you have carried unexamined in your own life, know that the examination is available to you right now, today, without requiring your own emergency to force it. You do not have to wait for a crisis to crack open the disguise your own caution might be wearing. You can choose, in this calm, ordinary moment, to look honestly at an assumption you have never quite stopped to question, and to extend, starting with your very next jet bridge, the trust that demonstrated competence has always already earned. That choice, available to every reader of this story, regardless of which character's experience felt most familiar, is the entire and complete gift this long account has been trying to offer, from its very first sentence to its very last. Take it with you. Use it well. And the next time you find yourself crossing any threshold toward a stranger whose competence remains, for the moment, unverified by anything beyond their uniform, and their credentials extend the trust first. Don't wait for the emergency to make you. This is truly the end of the story. Thank you for crossing it with me, all the way to the gate. One last word. Before the cabin lights come up for the final time on this particular telling, somewhere, right now, a young person who looks like Elias Coker, or like Marcus Holloway before him, is sitting in a ground school classroom, working through the same rigorous certification standards every pilot before them has had to master, carrying ambitions that will, statistically, encounter some version of the additional scrutiny. This story has tried to document honestly, rather than minimize. They do not yet know whether their own career will include a hydraulic failure dramatic enough to force a skeptic's reckoning, or whether they will simply fly 1,000 quietly excellent, entirely uneventful flights, demonstrating competence that the right kind of attention would have recognized from the very first day. If only more of the people boarding their aircraft had been willing to extend trust before requiring proof. What that young person needs, more than any single dramatic vindication, is a world increasingly populated by people who have done the work this story has been asking of you. The early, voluntary examination of assumption, undertaken in the calm, ordinary hours rather than postponed until crisis forces the looking. Every reader who closes this story having decided to extend automatic trust a little more readily, to interrogate their own pattern matching a little more honestly, to ask the second question instead of settling for the first snap judgment, makes that young person's eventual jet bridge crossing marginally easier, marginally less burdened by the unearned additional weight. This story has tried to document with as much honesty and as much care as 25,000 words could manage. That is the actual, lasting purpose of this long telling, not merely the satisfaction of one fictional reckoning, however moving, but the hope that some portion of its considerable length might translate, in some readers' actual life, into a slightly more examined assumption, a slightly more automatically extended trust. The next time a real jet bridge presents the real choice, this story has spent its entire length asking you to make differently. Safe travels. Truly and finally, the story is complete, and the choice, now, is yours to close. Truly, a brief return to the small folded photograph that opened this entire account, clipped to a flight bag for over a decade, touched before every single flight as a way of remembering exactly which version of himself needed to walk through that cockpit door. That photograph has, by now, been joined by others. Theo, at his first solo flight. Theo, at career day, holding up the original worn picture for a room of curious 11-year-olds. Theo and his father standing together at Renee's scholarship ceremony each year. The accumulating evidence of a life built carefully, deliberately. One demonstrated act of competence and care at a time, regardless of who was or wasn't paying close enough attention to notice. That is, in the end, the whole and entire architecture of this story, distilled past every individual crisis and every individual reckoning into its smallest and truest unit. A man decided, once, in the parking garage of a hospital, exactly who he was going to be for his son, for his passengers, for every stranger whose worst or strangest day might someday intersect with his own steady, demonstrated competence, and then he simply kept being that person. Checklist after checklist, flight after flight, for as long as the work was needed, which is to say, for as long as people kept boarding planes, crossing jet bridges, and trusting, whether they examined that trust honestly or not, that the person responsible for bringing them home safely had already, quietly, decided who they were going to be long before any single passenger's doubt ever had the chance to test it. Thank you, truly and completely, for flying this entire long story with me. From the first contemptuous word in that jet bridge to this final. Quiet landing. Safe travels. Always to the pilots. The single parents. And especially to the ones who are both at once. Carrying a flight bag in one hand and a child's entire world in the other. Every single flight. Every single ordinary and extraordinary day. Asking nothing more of the world than the chance to land safely and do it again tomorrow. The end. If this story moved you even slightly, consider sharing it with someone whose competence you have perhaps too readily questioned, or someone who has spent their own career proving twice what should have been assumed once. Let it be the small, unglamorous nudge that helps them feel seen. The way Marisol Vega saw Walter Brennan's grief. The way David Okafor saw Gregory Hutchins's genuine cardiac distress beneath his anxiety. The way Elias Coker saw, in every single passenger this story described, a complete human being deserving care, regardless of how their own crisis happened to present itself. That seeing, extended consistently and without requiring proof, is the entire and complete inheritance this long account has been trying, across every one of its considerable words, to pass on to you. Good night. Safe travels. And thank you, one final time, for staying with this story all the way to its true and final approach. A final reflection on what made this particular flight different from the thousands of ordinary, uneventful crossings that fill the bulk of any career in aviation. It was not that Elias Coker became, on this one afternoon, more skilled than he had been the day before. It was that circumstance finally provided a stage dramatic enough to make visible what had already been true across every prior flight of his career. The same precision, the same calm, the same methodical mastery of procedure under pressure that he brought to every single landing, witnessed or not, applauded or not, doubted or not. The hydraulic failure did not create his competence. It simply, for one afternoon, removed the curtain that ordinary, uneventful success usually leaves drawn across the considerable skill required to produce it. This is true of excellence in nearly every field, though we rarely think to articulate it this plainly. The surgeon's steady hands are exactly as steady on the routine procedure as on the complicated one, even though only the complicated one earns a dramatic story. The teacher's patient skill operates identically on the easy student and the difficult one. Even though only the difficult case produces a memorable anecdote, the pilot's mastery is the same. Flight after flight, whether or not a hydraulic system happens to fail on any particular afternoon. We notice excellence most easily when crisis forces it into visibility. The deeper truth, the one this story has tried hardest to honor, is that the excellence was there all along, on every ordinary day, waiting only for someone willing to look closely enough to see it without requiring an emergency to force the looking. See it now. Don't wait for the emergency. That is the final word this long story has to offer. And it is, perhaps, the only word that has mattered from the very beginning. Wheels down. Story complete. Until the next crossing. Safe travels to you and to everyone seated near you, carrying weights you cannot see, deserving trust you have not yet been asked to verify, but should extend anyway, simply because the certification, the training, the years of demonstrated record have already, quietly, earned it. That is the whole job. That was always the whole job. Fly safe. And see clearly. Starting now. 7 crews. 1 flight. 1 captain who already knew exactly who he was before any of them began. Long before the hydraulic light ever flickered. Long before Dorothy Vance ever stood in that jet bridge, deciding, wrongly, what his uniform meant. Pass this story on. And say their names: Dorothy, Gregory, Janelle and Marcus, Bethany, Walter, Marcus Holloway, and all the real people behind them in every cockpit, every cabin, every jet bridge, where assumption meets evidence and, far too often, loses the contest it should never have been allowed to enter in the first place. They are worth the early examination. They always were. Long before any emergency forced anyone to finally look closely enough to see it. The cabin lights have come up. The aircraft has reached the gate. You may now safely disembark, carrying with you whatever this long story was meant to give you a little more patience for the next stranger's unverified competence. A little more honesty about your own unexamined assumptions, and a little more willingness to extend trust before any crisis ever forces the extending. Welcome to your destination. Thank you, truly, for flying this entire story with us. From the first contemptuous word in that jet bridge to this final, quiet, hard-won landing, this is, finally and completely, the end of the story. Safe travels. Always, wherever your own next crossing takes you. And whatever jet bridge you find yourself standing in tomorrow, deciding, in those crucial first seconds, exactly who you are willing to see clearly before any proof is offered, and exactly who you are still, perhaps, waiting on an emergency to finally reveal to you. Choose to see clearly first. That has always been, and remains, the entire and only point. Good night, and safe travels to all of you, wherever your own crossings carry you next. Take care of each other up there, and down here too. That has always been, in the end, the entire and complete job until the next story, the next flight, the next jet bridge, waiting for someone to cross it differently than Dorothy Vance once did. Thank you for reading, and thank you for being willing to see clearly. Starting now. Rather than waiting for your own hydraulic failure to force the seeing, the end. Truly and completely. For the very last time. Fly safe. May every jet bridge you cross from here forward be crossed with clearer eyes than the ones you carried into the last one. That is the whole of it. That is everything this story ever wanted to leave you, carrying off the aircraft and into your own ordinary, extraordinary day. Welcome to your destination. Thank you for flying with us. All the way to the very last word. Safe travels. Truly and finally. To every single one of you reading this in your own seat. On your own journey. Carrying your own invisible weight tonight. Good night, and thank you, sincerely, for reading this entire long story all the way home. The story has landed. So have you? Safe travels. Always. Thank you. One final time for staying with this story all the way to its true and complete end. Safe travels. The end. Thank you for reading. Good night, and safe travels to all. The aircraft has reached its final destination. This story, at long last, is complete. Safe travels. Truly. Completely. And finally, thank you for everything. The end. Wherever you are tonight, be well, be safe, be seen. The story is finished. Thank you, truly, for reading it all the way through. Good night.